Imagine standing on the banks of a river that doesn't just flow with water, but with time itself. Picture a force of nature so powerful that it didn't merely carve canyons or nourish fields. It shaped the destiny of empires, decided the fate of dynasties, and became the beating heart of civilizations that lasted for millennia. This isn't just poetic imagery. This was the astonishing reality for countless ancient societies that learned to read the rhythms of their rivers like cosmic clocks. These seasonal floods transformed ordinary waterways into something far more profound. They became time machines, instruments of power that allowed rulers to predict the future, control their people, and build some of the most enduring political systems in human history. From the predictable, life-giving floods of the Nile to the volatile, terrifying surges of the Tigris and Euphrates, ancient cultures discovered that by mastering these natural cycles, they could master time itself. They learned to anticipate when the waters would rise, when the land would be ready for planting, and when harvests would be most abundant. But this knowledge wasn't just about survival. It became the ultimate tool of political control. Rulers positioned themselves as intermediaries between the people and the divine, claiming they could communicate with river gods and ensure bountiful floods through ritual and sacrifice. They built elaborate measuring devices, developed sophisticated calendars, and created engineering marvels that turned chaotic natural events into predictable systems of power. In this video, we'll journey back through the centuries to uncover how these hydraulic empires used their rivers as living, breathing time machines. We'll explore how the pharaohs of Egypt used the Nile's predictable floods to create a divine calendar that reinforced their authority for thousands of years. We'll witness how Mesopotamian kings turned the unpredictable fury of the Tigris and Euphrates into opportunities to demonstrate their engineering prowess and political strength. We'll discover how priestly classes developed early scientific methods to predict floods, then presented this knowledge as divine revelation to maintain their privileged positions. And we'll see how these ancient strategies of water-based control continue to influence our world today, from modern dam projects to contemporary water politics. This is more than just a history lesson. It's an exploration of how humanity learned to read nature's rhythms and use them to build civilizations, and how water, in the hands of powerful rulers, became destiny itself. This remarkable transformation of rivers into time machines began with simple observation. Ancient farmers watching the banks of their local waterways noticed that nature operated in cycles, not chaos. They saw how certain stars appeared in the sky just before the waters began to rise, how specific seasonal winds brought the rains that swelled the river channels, and how the behavior of animals changed in anticipation of the coming floods. These patterns became the first ticks of a natural clock, one that was far more reliable than any human-made device of the era. What started as practical knowledge for survival quickly evolved into something much more powerful, a system for predicting the future. The true genius of these early civilizations was recognizing that this predictable natural rhythm could be harnessed for political control. Imagine living in a world without calendars as we know them, where the changing seasons were your only markers of time. Now imagine a ruler who could stand before the people and declare, "In 30 days the waters will rise and cover the land," and then have that prediction come true with astonishing accuracy. This ability to seemingly command the forces of nature bestowed upon these leaders an aura of divinity and omniscience. They weren't just kings or chieftains, they became intermediaries between the people and the cosmic order, the only ones who could read nature's grand design. This control over time extended into every aspect of daily life and governance. The agricultural cycle became synchronized with the river's rhythm, with planting schedules, harvest times, and crop rotations all dictated by the anticipated flood patterns. Religious ceremonies were scheduled to coincide with specific hydrological events, turning seasonal changes into sacred observances that reinforced cultural identity and social cohesion. Even military campaigns were planned around these natural cycles, as armies needed to move before floodwaters made travel impossible or used the flooded landscapes as defensive barriers against invaders. The river's consistent behavior created a foundation of stability that allowed civilizations to flourish. Knowing when the floods would come meant knowing when to plant, which meant predictable harvests, which meant surplus food that could support growing populations, specialized labor, standing armies, and monumental construction projects. This hydrological predictability became the engine of empire building, turning scattered settlements into organized states with complex social structures and centralized authority. The river didn't just mark time, it created the conditions for civilization itself to emerge and thrive, binding human society to its watery pulse in ways that would shape political power for millennia to come. Nowhere was this connection between river rhythms and political power more perfectly expressed than in ancient Egypt, where the Nile's incredible predictability allowed for the creation of what we might call the world's first divine calendar. Picture this: every year, like clockwork, the Nile would begin its gentle rise in June, peaking by September, and then gradually receding, leaving behind that incredibly fertile black silt that made the desert bloom. This wasn't just a natural event, it was the very heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, so fundamental that they structured their entire concept of time around it. Their year wasn't divided into 4 seasons as we know them, but 3 distinct periods directly tied to the river's behavior. Akhit, the inundation period when the floodwaters covered the land; Perit, the growing season when the waters receded and crops were planted; and Shemu, the harvest time when the river was at its lowest. This hydrological calendar became so ingrained in Egyptian life that it shaped everything from agricultural work to religious festivals, creating a society perfectly synchronized with its environment. The pharaohs, those god-kings of ancient Egypt, positioned themselves as the crucial link between this natural cycle and the people. They didn't just rule Egypt, they claimed to actually control the Nile itself through their divine connection. In temple reliefs and official propaganda, pharaohs were shown making offerings to Hapi, the god of the Nile flood, or even personally commanding the waters to rise. During annual festivals celebrating the inundation, the pharaoh would perform elaborate rituals that were believed to ensure a proper flood, not too little, which would mean famine, and not too much, which could destroy villages. This theatrical display of power was incredibly effective propaganda. When the flood arrived as predicted, it appeared to confirm the pharaoh's divine status and right to rule. If the flood was inadequate or excessive, the priests had ready explanations involving the people's insufficient piety or the need for greater sacrifices, never questioning the system itself. Behind this spiritual theater operated a sophisticated system of hydrological science that would impress modern engineers. Throughout Egypt, priests maintained and monitored devices called nilometers, stone staircases, or elaborate columns marked with measurements that descended into the river. These weren't simple measuring sticks, but precise instruments that allowed experts to track the river's rise with remarkable accuracy. Teams of scribes recorded these measurements year after year, century after century, creating what may be history's first long-term environmental dataset. This information wasn't public knowledge but closely guarded by the priestly class who used it to make predictions about agricultural yields. The nilometer readings directly determined tax rates for the coming year. Higher floods meant higher expected harvests and thus higher taxes. During years of exceptional flooding, the state could claim greater shares of the wealth, while in lean years, the pharaoh could magnanimously reduce taxes, generating goodwill while still maintaining control. This system created what scholars call a hydraulic society, one where control over water means control over people. The Egyptian state, through its priestly bureaucrats, essentially held a monopoly on predicting the future. By knowing when the flood would come and how abundant it would be, they could plan agricultural production, set economic policy, and distribute resources in ways that reinforced their power. Loyal regions might receive advance warning of optimal planting times or preferential access to irrigation canals, while areas showing dissent might find their water allocations mysteriously reduced. The river's consistent behavior became living proof of the pharaoh's divinity, making the Nile both a timekeeper and a political tool that sustained one of history's most stable and long-lasting authoritarian systems. While the Egyptians enjoyed the Nile's predictable rhythm, the civilizations of Mesopotamia faced a completely different relationship with their rivers, one defined by volatility and terror. The Tigris and Euphrates didn't follow a gentle annual schedule but arrived with furious unpredictability, sometimes flooding at the wrong time of year or with such destructive force that they wiped out entire settlements. These weren't gentle inundations that promised fertility but violent surges that could destroy crops, drown livestock, and erase months of agricultural labor in days. This environmental reality forced Mesopotamian rulers to develop a completely different approach to hydraulic control, one based not on prediction but on protection, turning their vulnerability into a powerful tool of political manipulation. Kings throughout Mesopotamian history presented themselves not as divine timekeepers like the Egyptian pharaohs, but as heroic protectors and master engineers. When they commissioned massive irrigation networks, dikes, and canal systems, they weren't just improving agriculture, they were staging dramatic demonstrations of their ability to tame chaos itself. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of history's earliest legal documents, prominently features laws about irrigation and water management, showing how central hydraulic control was to his concept of kingship. In inscriptions and royal propaganda, rulers boasted about their water projects with the same pride they displayed for military victories, presenting canal construction as evidence of both technical superiority and divine favor. A king who could control these unpredictable waters must surely have the gods on his side. This political messaging found powerful expression in Mesopotamian literature, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains one of history's earliest flood narratives. In this story, the gods send a catastrophic flood to punish humanity, but one righteous man, Utnapishtim, is warned to build a boat and survive the deluge. Later Mesopotamian kings would subtly position themselves as descendants or reincarnations of these flood heroes, suggesting that they too possessed the wisdom and divine connection to protect their people from nature's wrath. These stories weren't just entertainment but political tools that reinforced the idea that centralized authority was necessary for survival in an unpredictable world. The message was clear: without a strong king and his administrative apparatus, everyone would be at the mercy of the rivers. The practical implementation of water control created a system of hydraulic politics that shaped Mesopotamian society at every level. By building and maintaining extensive canal networks, rulers could literally decide which regions would flourish and which would struggle. A city that remained loyal to the king might find its canals regularly dredged and expanded, ensuring reliable water access even during dry periods. Communities that showed dissent might discover their water allocations mysteriously reduced or their maintenance requests ignored. This control over life's most essential resource gave Mesopotamian elites extraordinary leverage over their populations, making rebellion not just politically risky but potentially suicidal. Who would challenge a system that controlled whether their children would eat? What's particularly fascinating about the Mesopotamian approach is how it turned environmental vulnerability into political strength. While the Nile's predictability allowed Egyptian rulers to create a stable, timeless system of control, the Tigris and Euphrates' volatility required constant demonstration of power through engineering achievement. Mesopotamian kings had to keep proving their worth through ongoing construction projects and maintenance efforts, creating a more dynamic but also more fragile political system. This need for constant hydrological management actually accelerated technological innovation in areas like mathematics, surveying, and material science, as engineers worked to build ever more sophisticated water control systems. The very unpredictability that made life so precarious in Mesopotamia became the driving force behind both political centralization and technological progress, showing how human societies can transform environmental challenges into opportunities for civilization building. Behind the thrones of pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings stood figures perhaps even more powerful than the rulers themselves, the priestly classes who mastered the art and science of flood prediction. These weren't merely religious figures chanting in temples. They were ancient combinations of scientists, meteorologists, and data analysts who developed sophisticated methods to read nature's signs. In an age without satellites or computer models, these priests became human supercomputers, processing centuries of environmental data to forecast the most important event in their civilizations, the annual flood that would determine whether their people would feast or famine in the coming year. In Egypt, this hydrological science reached astonishing levels of precision. Priests stationed at various points along the Nile maintained detailed records of flood levels, carefully noting the height of the waters on those stone staircases called nilometers. But their observations went far beyond the river itself. They discovered that the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when the bright star first becomes visible just before sunrise after a period of invisibility, consistently occurred just before the Nile began its annual rise. This celestial event became their primary forecasting tool, allowing them to predict the flood's arrival with remarkable accuracy weeks in advance. The priests didn't stop there. They also tracked wind patterns, animal behavior, and water temperature changes, creating a multi-factor prediction system that would be impressive even by modern standards. Mesopotamian priests faced a much greater challenge with the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their approach blended meticulous observation with what we might today call pattern recognition across multiple domains. They tracked the movements of planets, particularly Jupiter, which they associated with their chief god Marduk, looking for correlations with river behavior. They observed how specific cloud formations at certain times of year might predict heavier rains in the distant mountains where the rivers originated. They even developed early forms of probability theory by compiling records of past floods which years had brought devastation, which had brought ideal conditions, and which had brought drought. This data was recorded on clay tablets that formed something like ancient databases, consulted year after year to improve their predictive models. What made this knowledge so powerful wasn't just its accuracy, but how it was presented to the public. The priests and rulers worked in concert to create what we might call the ultimate information monopoly. The complex calculations behind flood predictions were never shared with ordinary farmers. Instead, the priests would emerge from their temples after periods of secluded observation and calculation to announce that the gods had revealed the flood would arrive on a certain date or reach a certain height. This theatrical presentation transformed empirical science into divine revelation, making the predictions seem like privileged communication from deities rather than the result of careful observation and record-keeping. This blending of science and spirituality created a self-reinforcing system of power. When predictions proved accurate, it enhanced the prestige of both the priesthood and the ruler they served. When predictions failed, as inevitably happened sometimes with such complex natural phenomena, the priests had ready explanations that actually strengthened their authority rather than undermining it. A failed prediction might be attributed to the people's insufficient piety, requiring more sacrifices or temple donations, or it might be framed as a divine warning that the king needed to demonstrate greater devotion. The system was essentially rigged so that both success and failure worked to maintain the existing power structure. The economic implications of this priestly knowledge were profound. In Egypt, the nilometer readings taken by priests directly determined the tax rates for the coming year. A high flood prediction meant expectations of abundant harvests, which justified higher tax demands from the central government. The priests' measurements became the foundation of the entire Egyptian economy, influencing everything from royal treasury planning to market prices for grain. In Mesopotamia, priestly predictions determined which regions would receive priority in irrigation projects and disaster preparation. A prediction of severe flooding might lead to the construction of additional dikes around royal lands while leaving peasant communities more vulnerable. This system created what scholars call a knowledge aristocracy, a class of experts whose specialized information gave them tremendous influence over society. Young men entering the priesthood didn't just study religious texts, they underwent rigorous training in mathematics, astronomy, and what we would now call environmental science. They learned to track celestial movements with primitive observatories, calculate volumes of water based on river depth measurements, and maintain the intricate canal systems that distributed floodwaters. This technical expertise, combined with their religious authority, made them indispensable to the ruling class. The psychological impact on ordinary people cannot be overstated. For a farmer living along the Nile or in Mesopotamia, the annual flood represented both hope and terror, the difference between prosperity and starvation. The priests, with their ability to predict this critical event, held the keys to psychological security. Their announcements created waves of relief or anxiety throughout society. A prediction of a perfect flood could trigger celebrations and economic optimism, while a prediction of inadequate waters might send communities into prayers and sacrifices. This emotional leverage gave the priestly class extraordinary influence over the collective mindset of entire civilizations. What's particularly fascinating is how different civilizations developed distinct priestly specialties based on their environmental challenges. While Egyptian priests focused on precise calendar-based predictions thanks to the Nile's regularity, Mesopotamian priests became experts in disaster management and emergency response due to their river's volatility. In China's Yellow River Valley, priests developed complex systems of divination using oracle bones to predict floods, creating another variation on the theme of blending spiritual practice with hydrological forecasting. Despite these differences, the fundamental pattern remained the same: religious experts mastering environmental prediction and using that knowledge to reinforce political hierarchies. The legacy of these ancient priestly practices echoes in surprising ways through history. The same impulse to predict and control natural phenomena eventually evolved into modern science, yet the social dynamics around specialized knowledge persist. Today's climate scientists and meteorologists occupy a role not entirely different from those ancient priests, experts whose predictions about natural events influence economic decisions, government policies, and public psychology. The main difference is that modern science aims for transparency rather than secrecy, though the tension between expert knowledge and public understanding remains very much with us. This control over agriculture through flood prediction represented perhaps the most sophisticated form of power ever devised in the ancient world. Consider what it meant for a ruler to possess the ability to essentially guarantee food security for an entire population. In societies where 90% of people were farmers and a single failed harvest could mean widespread starvation, the knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest was more valuable than armies or gold. The rulers who mastered flood prediction didn't just control territory, they controlled the very means of survival itself, creating a dependency so profound that challenge became almost unthinkable. The mechanics of this agricultural control were both simple and brilliant. As floodwaters receded, they left behind incredibly fertile silt that transformed river valleys into some of the most productive farmland on Earth. But timing was everything. Plant too early and seeds would wash away or rot in saturated soil. Plant too late and the precious moisture would evaporate under the sun, leaving crops to wither. Those who could predict the exact moment when soil conditions became perfect held the key to agricultural success. In Egypt, this knowledge allowed for the cultivation of emmer wheat, barley, flax, and other crops that formed the economic foundation of pharaonic power. The surplus generated by perfectly timed planting created wealth that supported not just the royal court but entire classes of artisans, soldiers, priests, and administrators who never had to farm themselves. This agricultural surplus became the engine of civilization building in ways we can still see today. With reliable food supplies, populations could grow beyond subsistence levels, leading to the development of cities with thousands of inhabitants. Specialization became possible. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, and scribes could focus on their crafts because farmers were producing enough food for everyone. This division of labor created economic complexity that required centralized management, which in turn strengthened state power. The grain stores filled by successful harvests became strategic reserves that could feed armies during campaigns, support construction projects during off-seasons, and provide relief during unexpected shortages, making the state indispensable to its citizens. The Yellow River Valley in China offers a particularly compelling example of how flood-based agricultural control created centralized power. Unlike the relatively predictable Nile, China's Yellow River earned the name China's Sorrow for its devastating and unpredictable floods that could suddenly change course and wipe out entire regions. The Shang and Zhou dynasties responded by developing massive, state-organized flood control systems that required unprecedented levels of coordination. Thousands of workers were mobilized to build and maintain dikes, dredge channels, and create irrigation networks that stretched for miles. This wasn't just agricultural improvement, it was a demonstration of state power on a colossal scale. What made these systems so politically potent was how they could be manipulated for social control. Irrigation canals weren't built equally for all regions. Priority access went to lands owned by the royal family, loyal nobles, and supportive communities. A village that questioned imperial authority might find its water allocation reduced or its maintenance requests ignored, while loyal regions enjoyed reliable irrigation even during dry periods. The state's hydraulic engineers became powerful political agents, their decisions about where to build new canals or repair old ones shaping the economic fortunes of entire regions. This created a system of hydraulic patronage where loyalty was literally watered and rewarded, while dissent was left to wither. The psychological dimension of this food-based control cannot be overstated. For farming families whose entire year's survival depended on the harvest, the state's ability to provide accurate planting advice created deep dependency and gratitude. When the harvest was abundant, credit went to the ruler's wisdom and divine connection. When harvests failed, the blame typically fell on local officials or the people's own insufficient piety rather than the system itself. This psychological dynamic made challenges to authority seem not just politically dangerous but almost morally wrong, a rejection of the very system that kept everyone fed. The military implications were equally significant. Well-fed populations could support larger standing armies, and grain surpluses could be stored to supply troops during extended campaigns. The Roman Empire's famous grain dole and Egypt's role as the breadbasket of the ancient world both demonstrate how agricultural surplus translated into military power. But beyond simply feeding soldiers, the control of flood cycles allowed for strategic planning of military campaigns around agricultural calendars. Armies could be mobilized after harvests when food was plentiful and men were available, or they could be used to protect planting and harvesting seasons from disruption. The rhythm of the rivers thus became the rhythm of warfare itself. This agricultural control system created what scholars call the hydraulic trap. Once societies became dependent on large-scale irrigation, they couldn't return to simpler methods without catastrophic population collapse. The infrastructure required too much maintenance, the population levels had grown too high, and the knowledge of alternative methods had been lost. This created incredibly stable but also rigid systems that resisted change and innovation. The very success of flood-based agriculture made these civilizations vulnerable to climate shifts or technological stagnation, as we'll explore in later sections. The legacy of this ancient agricultural control still shapes our world today. Modern nations still manipulate food production for political ends, whether through agricultural subsidies, export controls, or food aid used as diplomatic leverage. The Green Revolution of the 20th century, with its state-sponsored development of high-yield crops and irrigation projects, continues this ancient tradition of using agricultural technology to reinforce state power. Even our contemporary concerns about food security and climate change represent the latest chapter in humanity's long struggle to control the natural systems that feed us. Perhaps the most brilliant psychological manipulation of all was how ancient rulers transformed terrifying flood events into powerful political propaganda through carefully crafted mythology. Across multiple civilizations, strikingly similar flood narratives emerged not as mere folk tales, but as carefully engineered stories designed to legitimize ruling dynasties and reinforce social hierarchies. These weren't just stories about water, they were stories about power presented as divine inevitability rather than human choice. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, which predates even the famous Gilgamesh stories, tells of a great flood sent by angry gods to wipe out humanity, sparing only one righteous man and his family to repopulate the world under a new moral order. Sound familiar? This template reappears in the biblical Noah narrative, Hindu scriptures describing Manu's survival of a great deluge, and countless other cultural traditions from the Americas to Asia. What's fascinating is how these myths consistently served political purposes far beyond their surface-level religious meanings. Rulers throughout history claimed direct descent from these flood heroes, positioning themselves as the chosen representatives of a renewed humanity. In Mesopotamia, kings would trace their genealogies back to figures like Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, the flood survivors from various traditions, suggesting their authority wasn't just earned but inherited from those who had been literally saved by the gods for a special purpose. This created a powerful narrative of destiny. that the current ruling family wasn't just in charge by accident or conquest, but because divine forces had selected their ancestors to rebuild civilization after the waters receded. The timing of these mythological performances was carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact. During annual flood festivals, when communities gathered to celebrate or anxiously await the rising waters, rulers would sponsor elaborate reenactments of these flood myths. In Babylon, the Akitu festival featured ritual readings of the Enuma Elish creation epic, which included flood elements, reinforcing the king's role as protector against chaos. In Egypt, the Nile inundation celebrations included references to the primordial waters of Nun and the survival of order over chaos, with the pharaoh playing the central role in these ritual dramas. These weren't mere entertainment, they were powerful psychological programming, linking the natural anxiety people felt about the annual floods with the political need for strong leadership. These flood narratives consistently followed a three-part structure that served political ends perfectly: destruction, survival, and renewal. First, the old world is wiped clean because of humanity's corruption or disobedience, a warning about what happens when proper order breaks down. Then, a single righteous individual and his family are chosen to survive, often because of their piety or special relationship with the gods. Finally, this survivor repopulates the world under a new covenant or moral system, with instructions to maintain proper worship and social order. This narrative arc perfectly justified the existing power structure. The current rulers represented the new, improved system established after the cleansing flood, while dissent could be framed as a return to the corrupt practices that had brought divine punishment in the first place. The psychological genius of these myths lay in how they transformed traumatic collective memories into foundations for political stability. Many archaeologists believe these widespread flood stories may reflect actual catastrophic flooding events that occurred as glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically and what we now call the Black Sea may have catastrophically flooded inhabited areas. These traumatic experiences, passed down through generations, became raw material for rulers and priests to shape into narratives that served their interests. By framing these disasters as moral lessons rather than random natural events, they could use the deep-seated fear of flooding to promote social compliance and political obedience. The flood myths also created what we might call a theology of scarcity and abundance that benefited the ruling class. In many of these stories, the flood represents not just punishment but a reset button on resource distribution. The surviving family emerges into a world emptied of competitors, with all the land and resources now available to them and their descendants. This provided a perfect justification for the unequal distribution of wealth and power in ancient societies. The current elites weren't hoarding resources. They were simply enjoying what their righteous ancestors had been granted by the gods after the Great Cleansing. Those who questioned this distribution could be accused of challenging divine will itself. What's particularly interesting is how different civilizations adapted the flood myth template to their specific environmental and political circumstances. In Mesopotamia, where floods were unpredictable and often destructive, the stories emphasized the gods' capriciousness and the need for strong rulers who could intercede with these volatile deities. In Egypt, where the Nile's floods were generally beneficial and predictable, the myths focused more on the annual renewal and rebirth aspects, reinforcing the pharaoh's role as maintainer of cosmic order rather than protector against chaos. In both cases, the natural environment shaped the mythology, which in turn shaped the political system. The endurance of these flood myths into modern times demonstrates their powerful psychological resonance. Even today, the Noah story remains one of the most recognizable narratives from the Bible. and flood myths continue to appear in popular culture from movies to video games. This enduring appeal suggests that these ancient rulers tapped into something fundamental about how humans process trauma and uncertainty, the desire to find meaning in catastrophe, and the comfort of believing that someone is in control, even when nature seems anything but controlled. The political lesson wasn't lost on later rulers either. Numerous modern leaders have invoked flood imagery during times of crisis, positioning themselves as the ones who can guide society through turbulent waters toward renewal. These mythological frameworks created what anthropologists call charter myths, stories that establish the fundamental rules and structures of a society. By controlling these foundational narratives, ancient elites didn't just explain why they ruled. They made alternative forms of social organization literally unimaginable for most people. If the gods themselves had established the current system after wiping the slate clean, who were ordinary humans to question it? This psychological conditioning ran so deep that even when dynasties changed through conquest or rebellion, new rulers typically adopted the existing flood mythology rather than inventing new ones, simply inserting themselves into the established narrative of divine selection and renewal. The sophistication of this mythological propaganda becomes especially apparent when we consider how it addressed the problem of political legitimacy across generations. The first ruler might seize power through force or charisma, but his great-grandson needed a more enduring justification for why he should rule. Flood myths provided this timeless legitimacy by creating a story that transcended individual rulers and connected the current leadership to primordial events and divine choices. This narrative continuity helped stabilize societies that might otherwise have fractured with each succession crisis, creating a sense of permanent order that outlasted any individual leader. These massive hydrological projects represented far more than practical solutions to water management. They were the ancient world's equivalent of putting a flag on the moon, spectacular demonstrations of a state's power, wealth, and organizational genius that nobody could ignore. When a pharaoh ordered the construction of massive basins to trap and redistribute Nile floodwaters, he wasn't just storing water for dry seasons. He was staging the ultimate performance of royal authority, a concrete declaration that his will could literally reshape the landscape itself. These projects required mobilizing thousands of workers, feeding them, housing them, and directing their labor with military precision, an administrative feat that demonstrated the state's reach into every aspect of society. For an ordinary farmer seeing these colossal earthworks rising along the riverbanks, the message was unmistakable. The rulers who commanded such projects commanded the very forces of nature. In Mesopotamia, the scale of hydraulic engineering reached even more astonishing proportions. The intricate networks of canals and dikes stretching across the flat plains required constant maintenance and expansion, creating what amounted to a permanent public works program that kept thousands employed in the service of the state. Kings like Hammurabi didn't just build these systems, they proudly advertised them in inscriptions that read like ancient press releases, boasting about how they had brought abundant water to the people or made the desert bloom. These weren't subtle claims, they were bold assertions of technical superiority and divine favor, suggesting that only a king blessed by the gods could possibly accomplish such marvels. The physical infrastructure became living propaganda, visible proof that the current ruler deserved allegiance because he could deliver what no local chieftain ever could: reliable water security. The commemorative aspects of these projects added another layer of political theater. Egyptian temple walls featured detailed reliefs showing pharaohs personally directing hydraulic engineering projects, often with gods looking approvingly over their shoulders. These images transformed the practical work of ditch digging and mud brick making into cosmic drama, framing water management as a sacred duty that only the divinely appointed ruler could properly perform. In Mesopotamia, rulers had entire canals named after them, turning every irrigation channel into a permanent monument to their generosity and power. When farmers used Sargon's Canal or Hammurabi's Dike in their daily speech, they were unconsciously reinforcing the connection between political authority and life-giving water, making the state's presence feel as natural and necessary as the rivers themselves. The maintenance of these systems created what economists might call a virtuous cycle of power reinforcement. Well-kept canals and reservoirs produced agricultural surpluses, which funded more construction projects, which employed more people who became dependent on the state for their livelihoods. During the annual inundation season, the entire population could see teams of state engineers and laborers working to control the floodwaters, making the government's role in their survival visibly apparent. This created a powerful psychological bond between rulers and ruled. The state wasn't some distant abstraction, but a tangible force that showed up every year to literally hold back the waters and ensure everyone could eat. This regular demonstration of competence built trust and compliance in ways that mere force never could. What's particularly fascinating is how these hydraulic projects served as early warning systems for political decline. When central authority weakened, the irrigation networks were often the first things to deteriorate, as maintaining them required the kind of coordinated effort that only strong governments could provide. The archaeological record shows clear patterns during periods of strong pharaonic rule. Egyptian irrigation systems expanded and became more sophisticated. During intermediate periods of weak government, canals silted up and basin systems fell into disrepair. This created a feedback loop where political weakness led to agricultural decline, which led to further political instability. The condition of a civilization's water infrastructure became a direct reflection of its political health, a barometer of state power that everyone could see and understand. The psychological impact on ordinary citizens cannot be overstated. For people living in river valleys where a few inches of water could mean the difference between feast and famine, these massive engineering projects represented security in an uncertain world. The sight of a well-maintained dike or a smoothly flowing canal provided tangible reassurance that someone was in control, that the terrifying power of the rivers was being harnessed for human benefit. This sense of security created what political scientists might call legitimacy, the widespread acceptance that those in power had the right to rule because they delivered real benefits. A king who could keep the irrigation systems working didn't need to claim divine right. He had demonstrated his right through concrete achievement that improved every citizen's life. The scale of these projects also created new forms of social organization that reinforced state power. Building and maintaining massive hydraulic systems required specialized knowledge surveyors who could calculate gradients, engineers who understood water flow, administrators who could manage work crews and material supplies. This created a class of technical experts who owed their positions and prestige to the state that employed them, forming a natural constituency supporting continued centralized rule. The need for standardized measurements in these projects may have even spurred the development of early mathematics and writing systems, as rulers needed to keep records of materials, labor hours, and land allocations. In this way, the practical demands of water management may have actually accelerated the development of civilization itself. Different civilizations developed distinct engineering styles that reflected their political philosophies and environmental challenges. The Egyptians, with their relatively predictable Nile, focused on precision and measurement, creating elegant basin systems that distributed water with almost mathematical regularity. Their approach reflected the stable, hierarchical nature of pharaonic rule, orderly, predictable, and centrally controlled. The Mesopotamians, facing more volatile rivers, developed more robust and flexible systems with redundant channels and emergency overflow basins. Their engineering mirrored their political reality, prepared for sudden changes, capable of rapid response, and constantly requiring maintenance and vigilance. These different approaches show how environmental factors shaped not just technology but political culture itself. The legacy of these ancient hydraulic displays continues to influence modern politics in surprising ways. Today's leaders still cut ribbons on dam projects and irrigation schemes, understanding that visible control over water resources remains a powerful symbol of effective governance. The psychological appeal of massive engineering projects, the sense that humans can master nature for collective benefit, still resonates deeply, even as we've become more aware of the environmental costs. This ancient connection between water control and political legitimacy helps explain why modern nations continue to pursue enormous hydrological projects, from China's Three Gorges Dam to Egypt's Aswan Dam. The message remains fundamentally the same as it was thousands of years ago. Those who can command the waters command the future. Think about what it means to control time itself, not with clocks and watches, but by declaring when a new year officially begins, when seasons change, and when entire societies should plant, harvest, pay taxes, or go to war. This is precisely the profound power that ancient rulers wielded by tethering their calendar systems directly to the rhythms of their rivers. In civilizations dependent on seasonal floods, the calendar became far more than a way to mark days. It evolved into the ultimate instrument of social and political control, a framework that made the authority of the state feel as natural and inevitable as the rising and setting of the sun. By anchoring their concept of time to the predictable flooding of rivers like the Nile, these elites essentially made themselves the timekeepers of civilization, the sole interpreters of nature's schedule. The ancient Egyptian calendar offers the most striking example of this phenomenon. Their entire year was structured around the Nile's three seasons: Akhit, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. The new year didn't begin on some arbitrary date, but was precisely timed to coincide with the annual rising of the river waters, an event that also happened to correlate with the heliacal rising of the star Sirius. This convergence of celestial and terrestrial events was presented not as a simple astronomical coincidence but as a divine signal, a moment of cosmic renewal that the pharaoh, as a living god, could both predict and orchestrate. State-sponsored festivals marked this occasion with tremendous pomp and ceremony, transforming a natural event into a political spectacle that reinforced the pharaoh's divine connection and his indispensable role as the guarantor of the cycle of life itself. To celebrate the new year was to celebrate the pharaoh's power. This control over the calendar granted rulers a subtle yet overwhelming influence over the daily lives of every citizen. By declaring the official start of the inundation, the state could tell farmers exactly when to abandon their fields and when it was safe to return and begin sowing seeds. This created a society that moved in perfect lockstep with a state-directed schedule. The timing of religious ceremonies, the collection of taxes based on anticipated harvests, and even the conscription of labor for massive building projects were all determined by this flood-based calendar. The river's rhythm became the rhythm of human activity, and since the state controlled the interpretation of that rhythm, it effectively controlled human behavior on a grand scale. Resistance was not just a challenge to authority but a violation of the natural order of time. While the Egyptian system is the most famous, this practice of linking calendars to hydrology appeared in various forms across the ancient world. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed incredibly sophisticated calendar systems that were deeply intertwined with seasonal rains and the behavior of rivers and cenotes. Their long count calendar and ritual cycles weren't abstract mathematical exercises. They were practical tools for scheduling agricultural activities and religious ceremonies that reinforced the authority of priest-kings. These rulers claimed the ability to communicate with the rain god Chok and to ensure timely downpours for their crops. By accurately predicting the rainy seasons and coordinating community rituals around them, Maya elites positioned themselves as essential intermediaries between the people and the forces that governed their survival. Their calendar was a map of power written in days and seasons. The standardization of time itself was perhaps the most brilliant political innovation. Before centralized calendars, individual villages might have tracked time based on local conditions or varied traditions. A unified, state-sanctioned calendar replaced this patchwork of local time with a single, official timeline. This created a shared reality for everyone in the kingdom, from the delta to the southern cataracts in Egypt, fostering a sense of national identity while simultaneously eliminating competing sources of authority. Local chieftains or village elders could no longer declare their own harvest time or religious dates. Time itself had been nationalized. The state's calendar became the only calendar that mattered, making the central government the undisputed arbiter of reality for all its subjects. This calendrical power also allowed rulers to literally rewrite history and shape the future, by controlling the record of years, determining when one reign ended and another began, or even erasing unpopular pharaohs from the official records. Elites could manipulate how time itself was remembered. Furthermore, the ability to accurately predict the future based on calendrical cycles created an aura of omniscience. When a priest-king could announce, years in advance, the optimal date for a crucial religious ceremony that would coincide with the river's rise, it seemed less like careful science and more like divine prophecy. This command over past, present, and future time cemented the ruling class's status, making their governance appear not just beneficial but preordained and eternal, as constant and reliable as the seasons they so meticulously measured. This sophisticated system of flood prediction created what might be considered history's first data-driven economy, where tax policy wasn't based on arbitrary demands but appeared to flow directly from the river's own measurements. The nilometer readings along the Nile functioned like ancient economic indicators, with priest bureaucrats acting as the central bankers of their time, setting fiscal policy based on nature's anticipated performance. When the waters rose to optimal levels, scribes would calculate the expected agricultural surplus and determine tax rates that would funnel this bounty into state granaries and treasuries. This created the brilliant illusion of perfect fairness. The pharaoh wasn't taking more than his share, but simply collecting what the river itself had provided, making taxation feel less like royal extraction and more like natural law. The psychological genius of this system lay in its built-in flexibility during difficult years. When the nilometer showed inadequate flooding, the state could announce reduced tax obligations, positioning the pharaoh not as a taker but as a compassionate protector during hard times. These calculated acts of generosity generated immense goodwill while actually strengthening state control, as populations became increasingly dependent on the central authority's accurate predictions and subsequent relief measures. The state maintained control over food distribution networks even during shortages, allowing rulers to direct resources to loyal regions while potentially withholding support from areas showing dissent. This created a powerful dependency cycle where challenging the system meant risking not just political retaliation but actual starvation. Beyond simple grain taxes, this hydraulic-based economy influenced every aspect of ancient Egyptian commerce. The state could adjust expectations for other forms of taxation, craft goods, labor obligations, military service based on the anticipated agricultural yield. In abundant years, more people could be spared from farming for state projects like pyramid construction or temple maintenance. During lean years, labor obligations might be reduced to keep more workers in the fields. This created an entire economic ecosystem that pulsed with the rhythm of the river, making the state the central nervous system that coordinated all economic activity based on hydrological predictions. The system also allowed for sophisticated long-term planning that would impress modern economists. By tracking nilometer readings over decades, Egyptian officials could identify patterns and create what we might call ancient fiscal stabilization funds. In years of exceptional abundance, extra grain could be stored in state granaries to create buffers against future shortages. This strategic reserve management transformed the state from a simple tax collector into an essential economic stabilizer, further reinforcing its indispensability to daily survival. The ability to smooth out the natural boom and bust cycle of flood-based agriculture created unprecedented economic stability that supported Egypt's remarkable longevity as a civilization. This hydrological fiscal policy extended to international trade and diplomacy as well. Egypt's reputation as the breadbasket of the ancient world meant that its grain exports could be strategically deployed as diplomatic tools. In years of high floods, surplus grain could be offered to neighboring states as gifts that created obligations and alliances. During regional famines, Egypt's stored reserves gave it tremendous leverage over less fortunate neighbors. The predictability of the Nile's behavior relative to other rivers made Egyptian grain a remarkably stable commodity in an otherwise unpredictable ancient world, creating economic advantages that lasted for millennia. The administrative apparatus required to maintain this system itself became a powerful economic engine. The scribes, surveyors, tax collectors, and granary managers formed a substantial bureaucratic class whose livelihoods depended on the continued operation of the hydraulic taxation system. This created a natural constituency within society that had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, as their positions, prestige, and economic security were tied directly to the state's continued control over flood prediction and taxation. The system thus generated its own internal support structure that helped maintain stability across generations. What made this economic manipulation particularly effective was how it blurred the line between voluntary compliance and forced extraction. Since taxes appeared directly tied to natural abundance rather than royal greed, and since the state provided genuine value through accurate predictions and famine relief, paying taxes felt more like participating in a collective survival strategy than submitting to oppression. This psychological framing made the system remarkably resilient to challenge, as alternative arrangements would have seemed both politically dangerous and practically foolish. The river's consistent behavior made the entire economic structure feel equally natural and inevitable, embedding state power so deeply into daily life that it became almost invisible. The legacy of this ancient hydraulic economics can still be seen in modern systems of progressive taxation and disaster relief, where governments adjust fiscal policy based on economic indicators and provide assistance during natural crises. The fundamental idea that the state should smooth out nature's uncertainties through strategic intervention has its roots in these ancient flood-based systems. Even today, nations with agricultural economies still face the challenge of converting environmental unpredictability into economic stability, using modern technology to accomplish what ancient priests once did with nilometers and star charts. The methods have changed, but the essential relationship between environmental prediction and economic control remains remarkably consistent across the millennia. Military commanders in the ancient world understood something that modern strategists sometimes forget: that the environment itself could be the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. And nowhere was this more evident than in their sophisticated use of seasonal flood patterns. For these early generals, rivers weren't just geographical features on a map. They were dynamic instruments of warfare that could be played like tactical instruments depending on the time of year. The annual rhythms of flooding and receding created predictable windows of opportunity and vulnerability that shaped campaign strategies across entire regions, turning hydrological knowledge into a form of military intelligence as valuable as any spy network. Consider the Nile Valley, where the annual inundation created what military planners would call a campaign season, with almost clockwork precision. Egyptian armies knew they had to complete their movements before the floodwaters made overland travel impossible, creating a natural deadline that dictated the timing of expeditions. A pharaoh planning to campaign south into Nubia would need to launch his forces early enough to return before the Nile rose, or risk having his army stranded and isolated. Conversely, the flooded landscape could serve as a magnificent defensive barrier. An invading force from the east would find the approaches to Memphis or Thebes transformed into vast, impassable lakes, protecting the heartland of Egypt with a moat that nature itself provided. This predictable transformation of the battlefield meant that Egyptian military planners could operate with a confidence that their counterparts in less regular environments could only envy. The situation in Mesopotamia presented a completely different set of challenges and opportunities for military leaders. Unlike the predictable Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded with terrifying unpredictability, often at the worst possible times for agricultural communities. Astute commanders learned to monitor conditions upstream in the distant mountains where these rivers originated, using early warnings of heavy snowmelt or rainfall to anticipate flooding in enemy territories downstream. A Babylonian king might time his invasion of a rival city-state to coincide with periods when he knew their lands would be either submerged under floodwaters or parched by drought, exploiting environmental distress to weaken his opponents before a single soldier crossed the border. This hydrological intelligence gathering became so crucial that ancient states employed what we might consider early forms of environmental espionage. Spies were dispatched not just to count soldiers or map fortifications, but to measure river levels, assess soil moisture, and observe agricultural conditions in rival territories. In Egypt, teams of scouts would be sent upriver to monitor the Niles rising in the southern regions, providing advance warning of how the flood would behave when it reached the densely populated north. This information allowed the pharaoh to make strategic decisions about whether it was a good year to launch expensive military campaigns or whether resources should be conserved for domestic needs. The quality of the flood could literally determine whether it was a year of war or peace. The weaponization of water itself represents one of the most dramatic examples of environmental warfare in the ancient world. There are accounts from multiple civilizations of armies deliberately breaching dikes or diverting rivers to flood enemy territories, effectively turning the landscape itself against their opponents. A besieging army might redirect a river to cut off a city's water supply or contaminate its drinking sources, while defenders could release controlled floods to create moats around their walls or wash away siege works. These hydrological manipulations required sophisticated engineering knowledge and tremendous labor, but when successfully executed, they could achieve victories without costly direct assaults. The ability to command such natural forces demonstrated not just military power but almost divine authority over the elements. the strategic value of controlling key points along major rivers cannot be overstated. Fortresses built at river confluences or narrow points in valleys could control military and commercial movement for miles around. The Egyptian fortress at Buhan on the Nile's Second Cataract, for instance, didn't just guard against Nubian invasions, it controlled who could move up or down the river during different seasons, effectively giving its commanders the power to open or close the highway to the south. Similar strategic points existed along the Tigris, Euphrates, and other major rivers, where seasonal water levels determined whether armies could cross or ships could pass. Controlling these choke points meant controlling the rhythm of warfare itself. The logistical implications of flood cycles shaped military operations in profound ways. Moving armies required not just clear roads but predictable forage along the route, something that could be completely disrupted by unexpected flooding or drought. A commander launching an invasion during the dry season might find his planned route transformed into a swamp if unseasonal rains arrived, stranding his forces without supplies. Conversely, following a successful flood, the abundance of new forage could support larger armies moving through previously marginal territories. The timing of military campaigns became a complex calculation balancing hydrological conditions, agricultural cycles, and political considerations, requiring a holistic understanding of the environment that few modern commanders would need to match. This deep connection between hydrological knowledge and military success created a class of warrior scholars who understood both the art of war and the science of rivers. Egyptian military commanders often received training in navigation, hydrology, and engineering alongside more traditional martial skills. Mesopotamian generals maintained detailed records of river behavior stretching back generations, creating what amounted to early military environmental databases. This specialized knowledge became a closely guarded state secret, as valuable as any weapons technology or tactical innovation. A general who could read the rivers held the key to campaigning successfully in his region, while an ignorant commander might see his entire army destroyed by forces he never saw coming, the rising waters themselves. The psychological impact of this flood-based warfare cannot be underestimated. Populations that saw their rulers successfully predicting and manipulating water patterns for military advantage developed tremendous confidence in their leadership. When an Egyptian pharaoh could announce that the Nile would rise on a certain date and then use that knowledge to defeat an invading force, it reinforced his divine status and right to rule. Conversely, a military defeat caused by miscalculating flood conditions could undermine a ruler's legitimacy, suggesting that he had lost favor with the gods who controlled the waters. The river's behavior became a barometer of military and political fortune, intertwining environmental and human dramas in ways that shaped the destiny of empires. Long before satellites could monitor weather patterns or computer models could simulate hydrological cycles, ancient societies developed remarkably sophisticated systems for predicting the behavior of their life-giving rivers. These methods represented a fascinating fusion of careful observation and spiritual interpretation, creating what we might call sacred science, a hybrid approach that allowed priestly experts to forecast floods with surprising accuracy while maintaining an aura of divine mystery. In Mesopotamia, Babylonian priests would carefully examine the livers of sacrificed sheep, believing these organs reflected the will of the gods about coming events. They didn't stop with animal entrails, though these ancient scholars also tracked planetary movements, recorded cloud formations, and maintained detailed records of past flood levels, creating complex databases of environmental information that spanned generations. The key to their power lay in how they presented this knowledge, not as the result of empirical study, but as privileged communication from the gods themselves. Meanwhile, in China's Yellow River Valley, dynasties like the Shang developed their own distinctive methods of hydrological forecasting centered around oracle bones. Priests would inscribe questions onto tortoise shells or ox scapulae. Will the river rise abundantly this year? Or should we begin reinforcing the dikes now? Then apply heat until the bone cracked. These intricate fracture patterns were then interpreted as divine responses, with the answers typically favoring the ruling family's interests. What's fascinating is that these practices weren't purely superstitious. They represented early attempts to systematize uncertainty, to create structured methods for making predictions about an unpredictable world. The cracks might have been random, but the interpretations followed established patterns that reinforced existing power structures and social hierarchies. This blending of observation and divination created what anthropologists call esoteric knowledge, information that was deliberately kept mysterious and inaccessible to ordinary people. The complex rituals surrounding flood prediction, from the specific chants used during sacrifices to the elaborate ceremonies for reading omens, served as barriers to entry that prevented common farmers from developing their own forecasting methods. This monopoly on hydrological knowledge became a source of tremendous social power, as those who could predict the floods could essentially control the agricultural cycle, and thus the entire economy. The priests and rulers who mastered these systems positioned themselves as essential intermediaries between the people and the unpredictable forces of nature, making their continued authority seem necessary for collective survival. The psychological impact of these divinatory practices cannot be overstated. For farmers whose entire year's survival depended on the river's behavior, the elaborate ceremonies and mysterious rituals created a sense of comfort and order in the face of nature's terrifying power. When priests emerged from their temples after days of secluded observation to announce that the gods had revealed the flood would arrive on a certain date, it transformed anxiety into certainty, even if that certainty was sometimes mistaken. This emotional management was as important as the predictions themselves, helping to maintain social stability in the face of environmental uncertainty. The theatrical aspects of divination, the dramatic sacrifices, the smoke-filled temples, the cryptic interpretations, created powerful psychological anchors that helped communities cope with the existential stress of not knowing whether they would eat or starve in the coming year. What's particularly ingenious about these systems was how they were structured to maintain authority even when predictions failed. If the flood didn't arrive as forecast, the explanation was never that the method itself was flawed, but that the people had been insufficiently pious or that the rituals hadn't been performed correctly. This created a self-reinforcing system where failed predictions could actually strengthen the priest's authority by justifying demands for more sacrifices, larger temple donations, or greater displays of obedience to the ruling dynasty. The system was essentially failure-proof. Successful predictions demonstrated divine favor, while unsuccessful ones indicated the need for even greater devotion to the established religious and political order. The legacy of these ancient divinatory practices extends far beyond their original contexts. The human impulse to blend observation with interpretation, to seek patterns in nature while acknowledging the limits of our understanding, continues to shape how we approach environmental prediction today. Modern climate science, with its complex models and statistical probabilities, still must contend with the same fundamental challenge these ancient priests faced: how to communicate uncertainty and make predictions about complex natural systems that affect people's lives and livelihoods. The main difference is that today's scientists aim for transparency rather than secrecy, but the social and political implications of environmental forecasting remain just as profound. If you wanted to see the social pyramid of an ancient river civilization, You didn't need to look at a royal decree or a list of official titles. You could simply follow the water. The intricate network of canals and irrigation channels that spread out from the great rivers functioned as a precise map of power and privilege, with the clearest, most reliable flows always directed toward the lands of the elite. Royal estates, temple complexes, and the holdings of favored nobles received the first and fullest share of the precious floodwaters, ensuring their fields remained lush and productive even in drier years. The further you traveled from these centers of power, the more the water flow diminished, becoming a trickle by the time it reached the outer fields worked by common farmers. This wasn't an accident of geography. It was hydraulic engineering designed to make social inequality as visible and tangible as the crops in the field. This systematic prioritization transformed water from a communal resource into a powerful instrument of social control. The maintenance of these vast irrigation networks was typically organized as a corvée labor system, a form of tax paid through physical work that required every able-bodied citizen to contribute a certain number of days each year dredging canals, repairing dikes, and clearing blockages. While presented as a communal obligation for the common good, this system brilliantly reinforced the existing hierarchy. Peasants found themselves maintaining the very waterways that primarily benefited the elite, physically laboring to perpetuate the system that kept them in a subordinate position. This created a powerful psychological dynamic where ordinary people became invested in maintaining infrastructure that primarily served their rulers, all while being reminded of their dependence on central authority for their very survival. During times of water scarcity, this manipulation became even more explicit and politically potent. When drought conditions reduced the river's flow, royal officials would make very public displays of managing the crisis by strategically reallocating water resources. Regions that had demonstrated particular loyalty to the crown, or communities that housed important military garrisons, might find their water allocations protected or even increased during shortages. Meanwhile, areas with histories of dissent or resistance could discover their irrigation channels mysteriously receiving reduced flows, with the official explanation often blaming technical problems or natural circumstances rather than political punishment. This created a powerful incentive structure where compliance was literally watered and rewarded, while disloyalty risked agricultural failure and potential starvation. The psychological impact of this water-based hierarchy cannot be overstated. For ancient farmers whose entire livelihood depended on irrigation, seeing the fields of the elite remain green while their own crops withered made social inequality viscerally real in a way that abstract laws or taxes never could. This tangible disparity helped naturalize the power structure, making it seem as inevitable as the seasonal flooding itself. If the gods had truly intended equality, wouldn't the waters be distributed equally? The visibly greener fields surrounding palaces and temples seemed to provide divine endorsement of the social order, suggesting that those in power were naturally entitled to their privileged position. This physical manifestation of inequality helped prevent challenges to the system by making it appear to be part of the natural world rather than a human construction. The system also created what we might call hydraulic patronage networks that extended the reach of central authority into every village. Local officials appointed to manage water distribution held tremendous power over their communities, deciding which fields received water first and how much each family might receive. These officials typically came from wealthier landowning families and owed their positions to regional governors, who in turn answered to the central royal administration. This created a chain of dependency that ran from the poorest farmer up to the pharaoh or emperor himself, with each level understanding that their water access, and thus their survival depended on maintaining good relations with those above them in the hierarchy. The result was a remarkably stable system that encouraged compliance through dependency rather than just through force. What makes this system so fascinating is how it turned environmental management into social management. The technical knowledge required to maintain complex irrigation systems, understanding gradients, water flow, seasonal variations became another form of privileged information that reinforced social distinctions. The engineers and administrators who designed these systems formed a technical elite whose specialized knowledge justified their higher social status, much like the priestly class that controlled flood predictions. This created multiple overlapping justifications for inequality. Divine right, technical expertise, and administrative necessity all worked together to make the unequal distribution of water seem natural, necessary, and even beneficial for society as a whole. The material consequences of this unequal distribution extended far beyond the agricultural fields themselves. Reliable water access meant not just better crop yields, but also the ability to support larger populations, which in turn created more vibrant local economies with specialized crafts and services. Regions with priority water access developed into wealthy commercial centers with markets, workshops, and better infrastructure, while areas with marginal water supplies remained primarily subsistence agricultural zones. This created self-reinforcing cycles of development and underdevelopment that mirrored and amplified the existing social hierarchy, making the physical landscape itself a reflection of the political order. The patterns established by ancient water distribution systems can sometimes still be seen in the modern landscapes of these regions, with former royal lands often remaining more prosperous agricultural areas centuries later. This hydraulic hierarchy also shaped urban design and architecture in revealing ways. In many river civilizations, the most impressive water management features ornamental canals, elaborate fountains. Luxurious bathing complexes were concentrated in royal districts and temple precincts. Meanwhile, ordinary neighborhoods might rely on communal wells or secondary canals that carried water already used by the elite. The symbolic message was clear. The rulers could not only command water for practical purposes, but could also deploy it for pure aesthetic pleasure and demonstration of wealth. This display of hydraulic luxury served as constant reinforcement of the power differential between rulers and ruled, turning the control of water into theater that dramatized the social order for all to see. Even the most brilliantly engineered hydraulic empires, with their intricate canals and divinely sanctioned rulers, ultimately faced a force beyond their manipulation: the relentless and unpredictable shifts of Earth's climate itself. These civilizations had built entire political and economic systems on the assumption of environmental regularity, on the belief that the rivers would always rise and fall within a predictable range. But when that regularity faltered, when prolonged droughts or catastrophic floods outside living memory occurred, the very foundation of their power crumbled. Consider the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, which around 2200 BC controlled a vast territory through its mastery of Tigris-Euphrates water systems. Archaeological evidence from lake sediments and soil samples reveals a dramatic shift toward arid conditions that lasted for centuries, a climate event that would have drastically reduced the river flows the Akkadians depended on. Their elaborate irrigation networks, designed for a different hydrological reality, became monuments to a forgotten abundance as crops failed and famine spread. The central government, which had justified its authority through successful water management, suddenly had no answers for the environmental catastrophe. Regional governors who had once obeyed imperial commands now found themselves struggling to feed their own people, leading to political fragmentation and the empire's eventual dissolution into competing city-states once more. A similar story unfolded along the Nile during the decline of Egypt's Old Kingdom, a period that gave us some of the most poignant writings from the ancient world. Inscriptions and papyri from this era describe desperate times, the Nile's failure to properly inundate, years when the river seemed to turn to a trickle. One official lamented that the Nile was empty, people crossed over on foot, while another text describes children crying for food and the elderly despairing. The pharaoh, supposedly the divine guarantor of the annual flood, found his spiritual authority evaporating along with the river waters. Without the agricultural surplus that had funded the state bureaucracy and massive construction projects, the central government could no longer support the priests, artisans, and soldiers who formed the backbone of Egyptian society. Provincial governors began asserting independence, keeping what little grain they produced rather than sending it to Memphis, and within generations, Egypt fractured into competing regions. The pyramids, those magnificent symbols of pharaonic power, stood as silent reminders of what could be achieved when the Nile cooperated, and what happened when it did not. What makes these collapses so revealing is how they exposed the inherent vulnerability of systems that had seemed perfectly adapted to their environments. For centuries, even millennia, these flood-based civilizations had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for predicting and managing their rivers, creating the illusion of control over nature. But their success depended on climate stability, on the assumption that the patterns they observed would continue indefinitely. When those patterns shifted outside the range of their experience and technology, their entire political philosophy collapsed along with their agricultural systems. The rulers who had claimed special relationships with river gods found themselves powerless to prevent starvation, their divine legitimacy shattered by environmental reality. The priestly classes with their nilometers and celestial observations could accurately track the disaster, but offered no solutions beyond more fervent prayers and sacrifices that yielded no results. This historical pattern offers sobering lessons about the limits of human adaptation and the dangers of building societies too precisely around environmental assumptions that may prove temporary. These ancient civilizations weren't primitive or ignorant. They were brilliantly adapted to the conditions they knew, with agricultural practices, settlement patterns, and political systems finely tuned to specific hydrological rhythms. But their very success created a kind of rigidity that made them vulnerable to change. The massive infrastructure projects that had sustained them during normal years became liabilities during extreme events. Canals designed for moderate flows could become vectors for erosion during unusual floods or sit empty during prolonged droughts. The social complexity that abundance had supported the specialized crafts, standing armies, and monumental architecture became impossible to maintain when the agricultural surplus disappeared. Perhaps most importantly, these collapses demonstrate how climate change operates as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing social and political tensions rather than causing collapse in isolation. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, evidence suggests that environmental stress triggered conflicts over dwindling resources, with communities fighting over water access and stored grain. The central authorities, weakened by their failure to manage the crisis, lost their monopoly on violence as regional leaders raised their own forces for protection or aggression. Trade networks that had distributed resources across regions broke down as each area prioritized its own survival, leading to further isolation and vulnerability. The environmental crisis thus became a political crisis, which in turn deepened the humanitarian disaster in a devastating feedback loop. The archaeological record provides haunting evidence of these collapse events across multiple flood-based civilizations. In Mesopotamia, surveys show a dramatic decrease in settled area during the Akkadian decline, with many villages and even cities abandoned as populations moved or declined. In Egypt, tombs from the first intermediate period show a decline in artistic quality and material wealth, reflecting the breakdown of the specialized workshops that had depended on royal patronage. Soil samples from both regions show increased dust and decreased organic matter during these collapse periods, confirming the textual evidence of agricultural failure. These material remains testify to how thoroughly these societies were built on hydrological stability and how completely they unraveled when that stability disappeared. Yet within these collapses lay the seeds of future adaptation and resilience. The societies that eventually emerged from these crisis periods often developed new approaches to water management and political organization. In Mesopotamia, subsequent empires built more flexible irrigation systems with greater storage capacity and redundancy. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs who reunified the country implemented more sophisticated flood management practices and developed a less centralized political system that could better withstand regional variations in Nile behavior. The traumatic experience of collapse forced innovation and reorganization, creating systems that were perhaps less grand but more resilient to environmental variability. This historical perspective feels urgently relevant today as we face our own climate challenges. Like the Akkadians and Old Kingdom Egyptians, we have built complex societies deeply dependent on environmental stability, on predictable rainfall patterns, reliable growing seasons, and stable sea levels. Our technological capabilities far exceed theirs, but we face the same fundamental vulnerability of depending on systems we cannot fully control. Their experience reminds us that environmental change doesn't just affect weather patterns, but can unravel the social and political fabric of civilizations, particularly those where power is closely tied to successful resource management. The lesson isn't that we should abandon attempts to manage our environment, but that we must build systems with flexibility and resilience, acknowledging that the patterns we consider normal may not last forever. The physical proof of how ancient rulers turned water into power is literally written across the landscapes they once controlled, if you know how to look. Modern archaeology, armed with sophisticated tools like satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, has peeled back the dusty layers of time to reveal the astonishing scale of these hydraulic empires. From the skies above Mesopotamia, the ghostly outlines of ancient canal networks stretch for hundreds of miles, a sprawling web of waterways that once fed the fields of Uruk, and Babylon. These aren't just ditches, they're the fingerprints of centralized power, requiring thousands of laborers working in coordinated effort under state direction. The very scale of these projects proves that only a powerful authority could command the resources and organization to reshape the entire hydrology of a region. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveal a different but equally impressive approach to water control. Here, archaeologists have uncovered not vast irrigation canals but incredibly sophisticated urban water management systems. Every house had its own well and bathing area, with wastewater channeled into covered drains running beneath the streets, a level of urban plumbing that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, with its precise brickwork and sophisticated waterproofing, stands as a monumental public facility that likely served both ritual and practical purposes. This wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about demonstrating the state's ability to provide order and control over the most fundamental element of life, turning chaos into civilization through hydraulic engineering. The ancient rulers themselves were hardly shy about taking credit for these hydrological achievements. Inscriptions and monuments across the ancient world serve as permanent propaganda, boasting of royal water projects. The Mesa stele, erected by a 9th century BCE Moabite king, proudly describes how he built reservoirs and aqueducts to provide water for his people, a clear political statement about his effectiveness as a leader. Egyptian pharaohs left detailed accounts of their canal digging projects in temple inscriptions, always shown receiving divine approval for their efforts. In China, the legendary Emperor Yu was celebrated for taming the Yellow River's floods, with his success literally becoming the mythological foundation for the Xia dynasty's right to rule. These weren't just technical reports, they were carefully crafted narratives designed to link hydraulic achievement with political legitimacy. What makes this archaeological evidence so compelling is how it reveals the psychological dimension of water control. The massive public baths of the Indus Valley weren't merely functional, they were theatrical demonstrations of the state's power to create order and cleanliness amid nature's chaos. The ornamental lakes and pleasure gardens of Mesopotamian palaces showed that elites could command water not just for survival but for pure aesthetic enjoyment, a luxury beyond the imagination of ordinary farmers. Even the placement of royal complexes often reflected hydrological control, with palaces strategically located at the confluence of major canals or overlooking key irrigation points, physically positioning the ruler as the master of the waters that sustained society. The maintenance of these systems created archaeological patterns that reveal much about ancient social organization. The distribution of sluice gates and control mechanisms shows careful planning to prioritize water flow to temple estates and royal land. Labor camps identified along major canal routes testify to the massive workforce required to keep these systems functioning, with ration lists and administrative records detailing the complex logistics of feeding and housing thousands of workers. Broken tools, abandoned work sites, and hastily repaired canal breaches tell stories of both achievement and failure, of periods when the state's organizational capacity flourished and times when it strained against the relentless demands of water management. Perhaps most fascinating is how this archaeological record helps us understand the collapse of these hydraulic societies. In Mesopotamia, sediment cores from ancient canals show layers of silt accumulation that weren't cleared, evidence of declining maintenance as central authority weakened. In the Indus Valley, the gradual deterioration of drainage systems correlates with the abandonment of urban neighborhoods, suggesting that the loss of hydraulic control contributed to urban decline. These material remains provide sobering lessons about the vulnerability of societies that become too dependent on complex water management systems requiring strong central coordination. When the political will or capacity faltered, the very infrastructure that had sustained civilization could become a liability, with silted canals and broken dikes testifying to the fragile relationship between water, power, and social stability. This tangible evidence transforms our understanding of ancient power from abstract concept to physical reality. The carefully laid bricks of a Mesopotamian canal, the precisely carved markings on a nilometer, the massive stone aqueducts of Roman projects, these aren't just engineering achievements but political statements in stone and earth. They show us that ancient rulers understood something profound, that controlling water meant controlling people, and that the most enduring demonstration of power wasn't just conquering territory but literally reshaping the landscape to serve human will. The archaeological record stands as permanent testimony to how rivers were indeed transformed into time machines, with their flows synchronized to the rhythm of political authority across millennia of human civilization. While the Nile and the Yellow River both gave birth to incredible hydraulic civilizations, the distinct personalities of these waterways shaped two entirely different philosophies of power and control. The Nile, with its gentle, predictable annual flood, allowed ancient Egypt to develop a system of water management that was as much about spiritual theater as it was about practical engineering. The entire civilization operated like a perfectly synchronized clock, with the river's reliable rhythm enabling a top-down approach where the pharaoh, through his priestly bureaucrats, could issue decrees that were executed with remarkable uniformity from the delta to the first cataract. This centralized control was possible precisely because the Nile behaved so consistently. The state could plan years in advance, knowing with high certainty when the waters would rise, how high they would reach, and when they would recede. This predictability fostered a political culture where authority appeared divinely ordained and unchallengeable, flowing as naturally and inevitably as the river itself. In stark contrast, China's Yellow River earned its ominous nickname, China's Sorrow, through its terrifying volatility and catastrophic flooding. Unlike the cooperative Nile, the Yellow River carried enormous quantities of lower soil from the northern plains, constantly silting up its own channel and causing it to burst its banks with devastating frequency, sometimes dramatically changing its entire course across the landscape. This environmental reality demanded a completely different approach to water management, one that emphasized massive, coordinated emergency response and constant maintenance rather than precise prediction. Where Egypt could rely on priestly astronomers watching for the star Sirius, Chinese engineers had to become masters of earthworks and dredging, building increasingly sophisticated dike systems that required thousands of laborers working in coordinated effort. The constant threat of catastrophic failure meant that water management couldn't be purely centralized. It required regional officials who could respond quickly to local conditions while still following imperial directives. This fundamental environmental difference produced two distinct governance models that reflected deeper philosophical approaches to power. Egyptian pharaonic rule emphasized cosmic harmony and divine order. The concept of Mat, where the king's role was to maintain balance through ritual and correct observance. Their nilometers were as much religious instruments as measuring devices, and the distribution of water followed patterns that reinforced this hierarchical, unified vision of society. Chinese water management, particularly as developed during the Qin and Han dynasties, reflected a more pragmatic, bureaucratic philosophy where the state's legitimacy was earned through effective administration and technical competence. The legendary Emperor Yu, who supposedly tamed the floods not by building barriers but by dredging channels to guide the water to the sea, became the model ruler, one who worked with nature's forces through understanding and effort rather than simply commanding them. The administrative structures that emerged from these different approaches reveal how water shaped the very architecture of the state. Egypt developed a system where the pharaoh's vizier directly oversaw the Department of Waters, with provincial governors ensuring that royal decrees about irrigation and flood management were implemented uniformly across the realm. The entire system was designed to reinforce the idea of the pharaoh as the singular source of authority and prosperity. In China, water management became the proving ground for the imperial examination system, with talented administrators rising through the bureaucracy based on their success in controlling the Yellow River. Local magistrates were judged by their ability to maintain dikes and organize emergency responses, creating a meritocratic element within the authoritarian system that wasn't present in Egypt's more theocratic model. The psychological impact on each civilization was equally profound. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile's predictability fostered a worldview centered on cosmic order and cyclical renewal, which made their political system appear as natural and eternal as the river's annual flood. The Chinese, facing the Yellow River's capricious violence, developed a philosophy that acknowledged the world's unpredictability and emphasized human adaptation and resilience. Their rulers derived legitimacy not from maintaining perfect order, but from demonstrating their ability to mobilize resources and expertise against nature's chaos. Both systems used water control to reinforce political power, but one presented it as maintaining divine harmony, while the other framed it as a relentless struggle requiring strong, centralized leadership. What makes this comparison so compelling is how these ancient hydrological management philosophies continue to echo in the modern era. Egypt's Aswan High Dam, for all its modern engineering, continues the pharaonic tradition of massive, centralized control over the Nile, while China's ongoing struggles with the Yellow River still require the kind of regional coordination and massive mobilization that characterized ancient dynastic responses. The environmental personalities of these two great rivers didn't just influence ancient politics. They helped shape enduring cultural approaches to power, authority, and humanity's relationship with the natural world that continue to influence these civilizations thousands of years later. Imagine living in a world where the difference between abundance and starvation, between life and death, literally flowed with the river's current. For ancient civilizations along the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates, this wasn't abstract anxiety. It was the fundamental reality that shaped their entire psychological landscape. The relationship these societies developed with their rivers went far beyond practical dependence. It seeped into their collective consciousness, creating deep-seated psychological frameworks that rulers expertly manipulated to reinforce their authority for generations. This environmental psychology became the invisible architecture of power, more effective than any palace wall or army in maintaining social order. In Egypt, the Nile's remarkable predictability fostered what we might call a psychology of cosmic harmony. The concept of Mat representing truth, balance, and divine order wasn't just a philosophical idea but a lived reality that played out annually with the river's inundation. Egyptians developed what modern psychologists might describe as a secure attachment to their environment. They trusted that the waters would rise, the fields would flood, and life would continue in its proper rhythm. This environmental trust translated directly into political trust, as the pharaoh positioned himself as the guardian of this cosmic balance. His rituals and offerings weren't seen as superstition, but as essential maintenance of the natural order. To challenge pharaonic authority wasn't merely political dissent. It felt like threatening the very stability of the universe, risking the Nile's failure and collective starvation. This psychological conditioning made rebellion almost unthinkable, as it would require rejecting the system that guaranteed survival itself. Mesopotamian psychology developed along entirely different lines due to the terrifying unpredictability of the Tigris and Euphrates. Unlike the Egyptians' secure attachment, Mesopotamians lived with what we might now call environmental anxiety, a constant low-grade fear that catastrophic flooding could arrive without warning, wiping out crops, homes, and entire communities. This pervasive uncertainty created a psychological vacuum that rulers filled by positioning themselves as necessary protectors against chaos. Kings weren't just administrators but heroic figures who stood between the people and environmental disaster. The famous Babylonian creation myth Enuma Elish, where the god Marduk battles the primordial water goddess Tiamat, perfectly reflected this worldview, order constantly struggling against chaos, with the king serving as Marduk's earthly representative. This narrative framework made centralized authority feel not just beneficial but essential for psychological security in an unpredictable world. The rulers of both civilizations cultivated these psychological frameworks through sophisticated cultural programming. In Egypt, temple reliefs consistently showed pharaohs making offerings to Hapi, the Nile god, or even personally commanding the waters to rise. Annual festivals celebrating the inundation, featured elaborate reenactments where the pharaoh played the central role in ensuring the flood's success. Artwork depicted the Nile's bounty flowing directly from the ruler's hands to the people, visually reinforcing the connection between political authority and natural abundance. Meanwhile, Mesopotamian art often showed kings building irrigation projects or battling flood monsters, portraying them as engineering heroes and protective warriors. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of controlling nature and confronting mortality, served as psychological preparation for living with uncertainty while accepting royal authority as the best available protection. This psychological dependence created what we might call a cycle of reinforced compliance. When predictions proved accurate and floods arrived as expected, gratitude flowed toward the rulers who had seemingly orchestrated the outcome. When predictions failed, as they inevitably did sometimes, the psychological framework ensured blame rarely fell on the system itself. Instead, priests explained failures as resulting from insufficient piety or improper rituals, actually strengthening the system by demanding greater devotion and resources. This circular logic made the political structure virtually immune to criticism, as both success and failure could be used to reinforce the existing power dynamics. The psychological need for predictability in an uncertain world made people willing participants in their own political subjugation, because the alternative, facing environmental chaos without the supposed protection of rulers, felt far more terrifying. The generational transmission of this environmental psychology ensured its endurance across centuries. Children learned from birth to associate political authority with natural stability through stories, songs, and daily practices. In Egypt, the annual flooding season became a time of celebration and ritual that embedded political loyalty into cultural identity. In Mesopotamia, the constant maintenance of irrigation systems created community practices that reinforced dependence on central organization. This deep cultural conditioning meant that even during periods of poor leadership or inadequate flooding, the psychological framework remained largely intact. People might criticize individual officials or priests, but they rarely questioned the fundamental system that connected political authority to environmental management, because that system had become woven into their very understanding of how the world worked. What makes this ancient psychological manipulation so fascinating is how it prefigures modern concepts of environmental psychology and political legitimacy. These civilizations understood, perhaps intuitively, that controlling people required more than just force. It required shaping their fundamental perception of reality and their place within it. By aligning political authority with environmental security, they created systems of power that felt natural and inevitable rather than imposed. The river's behavior became the ultimate justification for the political status quo, making challenges to authority seem as foolish as challenging the rising of the sun or the flowing of water. This deep psychological foundation explains why these hydraulic empires endured for millennia while other political systems rose and fell relatively quickly. They had anchored their power not just in physical control, but in the very minds and hearts of their people. Though the empires of the pharaohs and the kings of Mesopotamia have long since turned to dust, the fundamental political power of controlling water has not just endured, it has evolved into a modern geopolitical force of staggering scale and sophistication. Today's superpowers wield hydrological engineering not with nilometers and divine decrees, but with satellite-monitored megadams and international water treaties that serve as instruments of foreign policy. The river, that ancient time machine, now operates with a global reach, its mechanisms updated from ritual to remote sensing, yet its ultimate purpose, to consolidate and project power, remains remarkably unchanged. Consider the strategic calculus behind China's ambitious dam construction on the Brahmaputra River, which originates on the Tibetan Plateau before flowing into India and Bangladesh. By building a series of massive hydroelectric projects, China gains the ability to control the river's flow, potentially storing water during the dry season or releasing it during periods of political tension. This creates a form of hydrological leverage over its downstream neighbors, a modern manifestation of the ancient principle that whoever controls the headwaters controls the destiny of those below. Similarly, in the Nile basin, Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has triggered intense diplomatic friction with Egypt, a nation that for millennia has viewed the Nile's flow as a matter of national survival. These contemporary standoffs echo the hydraulic imperialism of ancient times, where control over a river's source was the ultimate strategic advantage, proving that water politics still has the power to shape international alliances and ignite conflicts. Within national borders, the allocation of water rights continues to determine patterns of wealth, development, and political influence with the same force it once did in ancient Mesopotamia. The American West provides a striking modern case study where a complex legal framework of water rights, many dating back to the 19th century, dictates which farms flourish and which cities can grow. The ongoing battles over the Colorado River's dwindling resources, strained by prolonged drought and over-allocation, are fought not with spears but with lawsuits and legislative maneuvers. Powerful agricultural interests, urban water districts, and environmental groups engage in a perpetual struggle for access, demonstrating that water remains the ultimate political currency, a resource so vital that its distribution defines winners and losers in the modern economy, just as it did in the ancient world. Climate change adds a terrifying new variable to this ancient equation, introducing a level of unpredictability that would have challenged even the most skilled Babylonian diviner. The seasonal patterns that ancient civilizations learned to read and exploit are becoming increasingly erratic, with melting glaciers altering river sources and changing precipitation patterns disrupting agricultural calendars. Yet, even as the predictability of these natural cycles breaks down, governments are doubling down on technological control, using advanced forecasting models and massive infrastructure projects to manage the uncertainty. This creates a paradoxical situation where our ability to predict the hydrological future is diminishing just as our technological capacity to manipulate water reaches its peak, setting the stage for a new era of water-based political struggles fought over a fundamentally shifting landscape. The psychological dimension of water control also persists, though the language has shifted from divine mandate to national security and economic development. Modern governments justify massive dam projects not by claiming communication with river gods, but by promising energy independence, job creation, and protection from floods. Yet the underlying message to citizens remains essentially the same. Trust the state to manage this vital resource, for your security and prosperity depend on it. This creates the same cycle of dependency and reinforced authority that ancient rulers perfected, where the government's role in water management becomes its primary source of legitimacy and control. What truly differentiates the modern era is the scale of intervention and the global interconnectedness of water systems. Ancient Egyptian engineers could redirect the Nile's flow within their valley. Today's projects can literally reverse the flow of entire river systems between continents, creating hydrological dependencies that span international borders. The technology has advanced from simple irrigation canals to computer-controlled dam networks that can be adjusted in real time from command centers thousands of miles away. Yet despite these technological leaps, the core political dynamic remains recognizably ancient. Those who control the water control the future, and the river continues to serve as a time machine, not just measuring seasons, but shaping the destiny of nations in the 21st century just as it did in the 3rd millennium BC. This transformation of rivers into living deities represented one of the most brilliant psychological maneuvers in ancient political history. By elevating their waterways to divine status, civilizations didn't just worship nature, they created theological frameworks that made political obedience a religious virtue. The Egyptian god Hapi wasn't merely a symbolic representation of the Nile. He was understood as the actual divine force within the river, a bearded figure with pendulous breasts representing both masculine and feminine fertility, whose annual arrival brought life to the entire kingdom. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, Enki ruled over the fresh waters of the Abzu, the subterranean aquifer believed to feed the Tigris and Euphrates, serving as the source of all wisdom and civilization. These weren't abstract concepts but tangible divinities whose moods directly determined human survival, creating a powerful emotional connection that rulers could harness for political purposes. The genius of this system lay in how rulers positioned themselves as the essential intermediaries between these powerful river deities and the people who depended on them. Pharaohs didn't claim to control the Nile directly but presented themselves as the only humans who could effectively communicate with Hapi through proper rituals and offerings. During the annual festival of the inundation, the Egyptian king would stand before the rising waters, making ceremonial offerings and reciting hymns that positioned him as the nation's chief priest, negotiating with the divine forces on everyone's behalf. In Mesopotamia, kings would perform the sacred marriage ceremony with the high priestess of Inanna, symbolically ensuring the fertility of both land and people through their union. These theatrical performances transformed practical hydrological management into high religious drama, where the ruler's role became cosmically significant rather than merely administrative. Temple architecture reinforced this connection between spiritual and political power through deliberate geographical positioning. Major religious complexes were strategically built at hydrologically significant locations. The Temple of Khnum at Elephantine stood at the Nile's first cataract where the annual flood was first detected, making it the ideal place to monitor and ritually welcome the incoming waters. In Mesopotamia, the Abzu temple dedicated to Enki at Eridu was constructed where the fresh waters of the aquifer were believed to emerge, physically marking the spot where divine power entered the human world. These weren't just convenient locations, they were theological statements in stone, declaring that access to the gods required passing through state-sanctioned spaces controlled by royal priesthoods. The very geography of worship reinforced the political hierarchy. This sacralization of rivers created an incredibly effective shield against political dissent by making practical criticism seem like religious blasphemy. A farmer questioning Chinese letter of water distribution wasn't just challenging a regional official but potentially opposing the will of Hapi or Enki themselves. When priests declared that certain irrigation policies reflected divine intention, opposing those policies risked not just earthly punishment but cosmic consequences that might anger the river gods and jeopardize the entire community's survival. This psychological framework made resistance feel both morally wrong and dangerously foolish, as it threatened the delicate balance between humanity and the divine forces that controlled their water supply. The most pragmatic water management decisions gained supernatural justification that made them nearly unchallengeable. The fusion of religious ceremony and hydrological practice reached its most sophisticated form in the symbolic reenactments that punctuated the ritual calendar. In Babylon, the Akitu New Year festival featured a dramatic procession where statues of the gods were carried from the city to a special temple outside the walls, then triumphantly returned, a ritual that mirrored the seasonal retreat and return of the Euphrates waters. Egyptian Opet festival involved carrying the statue of Ammon from Karnak to Luxor along a ceremonial avenue that paralleled the Nile's course, physically demonstrating the connection between temple ritual and river dynamics. These weren't mere pageantry but crucial psychological reinforcements that linked the stability of the natural world with the proper performance of state-sponsored religion. This spiritual dimension also provided rulers with a powerful explanatory framework for dealing with hydrological disasters that might otherwise undermine their authority. When unusually high floods destroyed villages or insufficient flooding caused famine, priests could interpret these events as divine displeasure with the people's behavior rather than failures of prediction or management. The solution wasn't political reform but increased devotion, more sacrifices, larger temple donations, greater obedience to the priestly class and their royal patrons. This circular logic made the system virtually self-reinforcing, as both success and failure could be used to strengthen the existing power structure. The river gods became perfect political scapegoats, their divine will explaining away any shortcomings in human management. The resilience of these theohydraulic systems stemmed from their ability to operate on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. On a practical level, they provided frameworks for managing essential water resources. Socially, they created shared rituals that reinforced community bonds. Politically, they legitimized hierarchical authority. Spiritually, they addressed fundamental human needs for meaning and connection to the natural world. This multidimensional integration made these systems extraordinarily durable, capable of surviving dynastic changes, foreign invasions, and even significant environmental shifts. The connection between river worship and political power proved so effective that elements of these ancient systems persist in modern water management approaches, where technical control still carries symbolic weight and political leaders still derive legitimacy from their ability to provide water security for their populations. Beneath the grand narratives of pharaohs and kings directing massive hydraulic projects lies a quieter, equally vital story: the indispensable role women played in the day-to-day water management that kept these ancient societies alive. While male rulers often claimed credit for controlling the great rivers, it was frequently women who managed the water's journey from the main canals to the individual family plots, possessing intimate knowledge of local soil conditions, seasonal variations, and small-scale irrigation techniques passed down through generations. This created a fascinating duality in flood-based civilizations: a public, male-dominated world of monumental dams and state-sponsored rituals, existing alongside a private, often female-controlled realm of household water management and community-based knowledge that was just as critical for survival. This feminine connection to water often found divine expression in the very gods these civilizations worshipped. Consider the Hindu goddess Ganga, who isn't just symbolized by the Ganges River but is understood to be the river itself, a powerful female deity whose waters cleanse spiritual impurity and grant salvation to those who touch her. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, the goddess Anukit was worshipped as the personification of the Nile River, particularly its life-giving inundation, while Satet controlled the river's flow from the cataracts. These feminine divinities presented water not as something to be conquered or controlled, but as a sacred, generative force that required reverence and understanding. This theological framework created space for women to exercise authority in water-related rituals, serving as priestesses who interpreted the will of these powerful goddesses and presided over ceremonies asking for their benevolence. At the most practical level, women's water knowledge often made the difference between abundance and scarcity for individual households and communities. While men might have labored on the massive state-organized canal projects, women typically managed the distribution of water within local irrigation networks, deciding which family plots received water first and how much each should get based on crop needs and soil conditions. They developed sophisticated understanding of how to maximize minimal water access through techniques like pot irrigation, using clay vessels with small holes that allowed water to seep slowly into the soil around precious plants. This micro-level water management required constant attention and nuanced knowledge that rarely appeared in official records, but was essential for converting the state's macro-level water control into actual food on family tables. The annual flood festivals that celebrated the river's renewal provided particularly important opportunities for women's ritual participation. In many cultures, these ceremonies featured women dancing with water jars, singing songs praising the river's fertility, or leading processions to the water's edge with offerings of flowers and food. These weren't merely symbolic gestures, but were understood as magically potent actions that helped ensure the river's continued generosity. In Mesopotamia, priestesses of Inanna played central roles in ceremonies asking the goddess to bring the life-giving floods, while in Egypt, women participated in the festival of the Nile inundation by throwing offerings directly into the rising waters. These ritual roles gave women recognized authority within specific religious contexts, even when they were excluded from other forms of power. This gendered division of water management created what scholars call a hydraulic hierarchy that operated differently at various social levels. While men typically controlled the large-scale infrastructure and official water distribution systems, women often managed the community level and household water resources that determined daily survival. They were the ones who collected and stored drinking water, managed household sanitation, decided how much water to allocate for cooking versus cleaning, and passed on knowledge about which water sources remained pure during different seasons. This practical expertise gave women significant influence within their communities, even when formal power structures were dominated by men. The knowledge women maintained about local water sources represented a crucial backup system for when the state-controlled hydraulic projects failed. While the official irrigation networks might suffer from silting or poor maintenance during periods of weak central government, women's knowledge of secondary water sources, small springs, seasonal streams, and reliable wells could mean the difference between survival and starvation for their communities. This distributed knowledge system provided resilience against the failure of centralized water management, creating a safeguard that helped civilizations weather periods of political instability or environmental stress. The state might control the river, but women often controlled the knowledge of how to find water when the river couldn't provide. This complex interplay between gender and water management challenges simplistic understandings of these ancient societies as purely patriarchal. While formal power was indeed concentrated in male hands, women exercised significant authority within specific domains related to water, fertility, and household management. This created a more nuanced social fabric where female influence operated alongside male power, sometimes complementing it and sometimes providing alternative sources of knowledge and authority. Recognizing these gendered dimensions gives us a more complete picture of how flood-based civilizations actually functioned, not as simple top-down hierarchies, but as complex systems where different kinds of power and knowledge operated at different levels of society. The legacy of these ancient patterns can still be seen in many parts of the world today, where women remain primarily responsible for water collection and household water management, even as men typically control the large-scale infrastructure and official decision-making about water resources. This continuity suggests how deeply these gendered roles became embedded in human societies organized around river systems, creating patterns of responsibility and knowledge that have persisted across millennia despite enormous changes in technology and social organization. The ancient connection between women and water management represents one of the most enduring but least recognized threads connecting us to our hydraulic past. Behind the dramatic rituals and grand pronouncements about river gods lay something far more practical and arguably more powerful: the quiet, meticulous work of mathematics. Ancient priests and scholars didn't just pray for flood predictions. They calculated them using sophisticated mathematical techniques that would form the foundation of what we now call data science. Picture an Egyptian priest standing beside a nilometer, that stone staircase descending into the Nile, carefully noting the water level on a clay tablet. This wasn't mere record-keeping. It was data collection on a monumental scale, with generations of priests maintaining what amounted to the world's first long-term environmental dataset. They used basic geometry to calculate the volume of water represented by each increment of rise, then correlated these numbers with agricultural outcomes from previous years. A rise of 16 cubits might mean bumper crops of emmer wheat, while 18 cubits could predict excellent flax harvests for linen production. These calculations allowed them to make remarkably accurate predictions about how much land would be fertilized by the silt-rich waters and what crop yields could be expected, information that became the basis for everything from tax assessments to military planning. In Mesopotamia, where the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates demanded a different approach, scholars developed what we might recognize as early statistical analysis. Babylonian priests maintained detailed records of flood levels dating back centuries, creating tables that tracked not just height but timing, duration, and even watercolor and sediment content. They identified patterns and cycles that allowed them to make probabilistic forecasts, not certain predictions like their Egyptian counterparts, but calculated estimates of likelihood based on historical patterns. When they observed that years with particular planetary alignments often correlated with higher floods, they weren't just engaging in astrology. They were practicing an early form of correlation analysis, seeking relationships between celestial events and terrestrial outcomes. These mathematical models, inscribed on countless cuneiform tablets, represented humanity's first attempts to impose numerical order on nature's chaos, transforming terrifying uncertainty into manageable risk through the power of mathematics. The development of accurate calendars required perhaps the most sophisticated mathematical prowess of all. Creating a reliable system for tracking time based on celestial movements and hydrological cycles demanded advanced understanding of fractions, ratios, and cyclical patterns. The Egyptian calendar's near-perfect alignment with the solar year and the Nile flood cycle didn't happen by accident. It resulted from precise astronomical observations and complex calculations that accounted for the slight discrepancy between the solar year and the lunar cycles they also tracked. Mayan priests in Mesoamerica performed similar mathematical marvels, developing calendar systems that accurately predicted seasonal rains and river behaviors centuries into the future. This mathematical mastery created what we might call temporal sovereignty, the power to declare when years began and ended, when seasons changed, and when important activities should occur. This control over time itself became the ultimate demonstration of intellectual superiority, proving that the ruling class didn't just have privileged access to the gods, but possessed knowledge so advanced it seemed supernatural to ordinary people. What made these mathematical systems so politically potent was how they were deliberately shrouded in secrecy and mysticism. The complex calculations behind flood predictions were never shared with the public. Instead, rulers and priests presented the results as divine revelations. A Babylonian priest might emerge from days of complex calculations with a prediction about the spring flood, but he would announce it as a message from Enki, the water god. An Egyptian official might use geometrical calculations to determine optimal tax rates based on nilometer readings, but the farmers would be told the pharaoh had communed with Hapi to learn the river's intentions. This deliberate obfuscation transformed mathematics from a practical tool into a source of mystical authority, making numerical literacy a marker of elite status while ensuring the general population remained dependent on those who could read the numerical signs. The ability to work with numbers became a form of privileged knowledge that separated the rulers from the ruled as effectively as palace walls or royal guards. This mathematical governance created self-reinforcing systems of power that were remarkably resistant to challenge. Because the predictions were based on actual data and calculations, they were often correct enough to maintain credibility, while any errors could be explained away as resulting from insufficient piety or improper ritual observance. The system was essentially rigged to ensure that both success and failure reinforced the existing power structure. Those who understood the mathematics could adjust their predictions based on real-time data while maintaining the appearance of consistent divine favor, creating a feedback loop where mathematical accuracy and political control strengthened each other. The river's behavior, quantified into numbers and patterns, became not just a natural phenomenon but a political instrument that measured the legitimacy of the state itself. Walk through any ancient temple or palace, and you wouldn't just see art, you would see a sophisticated propaganda machine carved in stone and painted on walls, all designed to shape reality itself. The rulers of these hydraulic empires understood something profound, that controlling water required more than engineering. It demanded the control of imagination. So they commissioned artists to create works that would visually cement their authority, transforming practical flood management into a divine drama where kings and pharaohs played the starring role. In Egyptian reliefs that stretch across temple walls, we see this narrative crafted with stunning clarity. There's the pharaoh standing tall and calm, presenting offerings to Hapi, the god of the Nile inundation. The river god is often shown as a robust, fertile figure carrying trays overflowing with produce, his body adorned with lotus plants and papyrus reeds. But look closer, the pharaoh isn't just worshipping. In many scenes, he's shown controlling the river's chaotic forces, sometimes even strangling symbolic river monsters or mastering hippopotami, animals associated with the destructive potential of untamed waters. These weren't just decorative images, they were visual arguments insisting that without the pharaoh's unique divine connection, the Nile itself would turn from life-giver to destroyer. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, cylinder seals, small carved stones rolled across clay tablets to create impressions, tell a similar story of hydrological heroism. These tiny masterpieces, used to mark ownership and official documents, frequently feature kings and heroes battling water demons or controlling mythical river beasts. On one famous seal, we see the legendary hero Gilgamesh, a stand-in for the ideal Mesopotamian ruler, holding back the raging waters personified as a monstrous figure. Another shows a king figure standing between two flowing rivers, his hands raised to command their flow. These images, reproduced thousands of times on administrative documents and trade goods, constantly reinforced the message that political authority and water control were inseparable. Every time a merchant opened a clay tablet sealed with this imagery, or a scribe filed a tax record marked with these symbols, they received a miniature lesson in the necessity of strong, central rule. The art served as a constant, subtle reminder that chaos awaited without the king's guiding hand. Beyond grand monuments and official seals, this hydrological propaganda permeated everyday life through more humble objects. Egyptian pottery, used in households across the social spectrum, often featured designs celebrating the Nile's abundance, lotus flowers, papyrus plants, and zigzag lines representing water, all motifs that implicitly praised the system that delivered that abundance. Frescoes in the homes of wealthy officials showed idyllic scenes of agricultural prosperity, with irrigation canals neatly dividing perfectly ordered fields, visually arguing for the benefits of centralized water management. Even children's toys and women's cosmetic palettes carried these themes, making the connection between political power and natural order feel as natural and unquestionable as the household objects people used daily. This saturation of visual culture created what we might now call a manufactured consensus, where alternative ways of organizing society became literally unimaginable because they never appeared in the art that shaped people's understanding of the world. The literary arts played an equally crucial role in this psychological project. The great Hymn to the Nile, copied by scribes for centuries, perfectly illustrates this fusion of nature worship and political praise. The text begins by celebrating the river's life-giving properties, who creates all that is good / who satisfies the deserts with watercress, painting a picture of natural abundance. But then it seamlessly transitions to praising the pharaoh, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who is in the palace / he is the god who makes the Nile flow. The poem doesn't just thank the river, it explicitly credits the ruler with causing the inundation, blending ecological reality with political fiction in a way that reinforced Pharaonic authority with every recitation. Similar texts from Mesopotamia, like the Exaltation of Inanna, praise goddesses of water and fertility while prominently featuring kings who enjoy their special favor, creating a literary ecosystem where nature, divinity, and political power were permanently intertwined. This artistic campaign achieved its most brilliant effect by making the political system feel as inevitable and natural as the seasonal floods themselves. When every temple wall, every official seal, every household object, and every recited poem tells the same story, that rulers control the waters and water means life, then challenging that authority becomes equivalent to challenging nature itself. The art created a closed symbolic universe where the existing power structure wasn't presented as one option among many, but as the only possible way the world could function. This cultural environment made rebellion not just politically dangerous but psychologically difficult, as it required rejecting an entire worldview that had been embedded in everything from grand architecture to children's stories. The rulers of these ancient hydraulic empires may not have had social media or broadcast news, but through their control of artistic representation, they achieved something perhaps even more powerful. They shaped reality itself, making their authority seem as natural and necessary as the rivers that sustained their civilizations. The fingerprints of ancient hydraulic management are all over our modern governments, if you know where to look. That fundamental idea that the state should centrally manage essential resources like water for the common good didn't emerge from political theory textbooks. It flowed directly from the irrigation canals of Mesopotamia and the Nile basin. Today's massive bureaucratic structures, from the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States to the Ministry of Water Resources in China, are the direct descendants of institutions like Egypt's Department of Waters, which Pharaoh Senusret III established over 38 centuries ago to oversee the Nile's irrigation systems. These weren't minor offices but some of the world's first large-scale administrative bureaucracies, complete with hierarchies of officials, standardized procedures, and systematic record-keeping that would feel familiar to any modern civil servant. The ancient scribes who measured flood levels and calculated grain taxes were essentially the first data analysts working for the state, establishing patterns of governance that have persisted with remarkable consistency across millennia. This legacy manifests most visibly in how modern nations approach massive infrastructure projects. When the U.S. government built the Hoover Dam during the Great Depression, or when China constructed the Three Gorges Dam in the 21st century, they were operating on principles that would have made perfect sense to an Egyptian pharaoh or a Babylonian king. These projects demonstrate state power on a colossal scale, require enormous centralized coordination, and serve both practical and symbolic purposes, providing water and energy, while simultaneously showcasing the government's ability to tame nature for public benefit. Even in democratic societies where we theoretically distrust centralized power, we still accept that only the government can undertake such massive hydrological interventions, precisely because the ancient model proved that water management requires coordination beyond what individual communities or private interests can achieve. This creates an interesting paradox where modern democracies maintain essentially pharaonic approaches to water infrastructure while wrapping them in contemporary political justifications. The administrative DNA of these hydraulic empires even shapes how we organize knowledge and expertise within governments. Ancient Egypt's precise record-keeping of Nile flood levels, maintained year after year, century after century, established the template for modern environmental monitoring systems. Today's satellite tracking of river flows, groundwater mapping, and climate modeling all serve the same essential purpose as those nilometer readings, giving the state predictive power over natural systems that affect everyone's survival. The specialized priesthoods that once interpreted flood omens have evolved into today's technical agencies staffed by hydrologists, engineers, and climate scientists. But their social role remains strikingly similar: experts whose specialized knowledge about the environment gives them influence over political decision-making. The main difference is that modern experts are supposed to make their data public rather than treating it as sacred mystery, though the tension between technical expertise and democratic accountability remains very much with us. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in how these ancient systems established the very concept of public infrastructure as a government responsibility. The idea that the state should build and maintain canals, dams, and irrigation networks, and that citizens should contribute to these projects through taxation or labor, emerged directly from hydraulic civilizations. This established a fundamental bargain between rulers and ruled that continues to shape modern governance. The state provides essential services that individuals cannot provide for themselves, and in return, it gains the authority to demand resources and compliance from its citizens. Even our modern debates about infrastructure spending, tax policy, and the proper role of government echo ancient discussions about how to maintain irrigation systems and who should bear the costs. The philosophical foundation that underpins everything from municipal water systems to national highway networks was first laid thousands of years ago along the banks of the world's great rivers, where successful governance literally depended on keeping the water flowing. This hydraulic legacy also helps explain the persistent tension between local autonomy and central control that characterizes so many modern governments. Ancient rulers constantly struggled to balance the need for standardized, large-scale water management with the reality that local conditions varied significantly along a river's course. Their solution, creating centralized authorities that set broad policies while delegating implementation to regional governors, established the template for the federal systems that many countries use today. The same challenges that pharaohs faced in managing the Nile Delta versus Upper Egypt are echoed in modern debates about how to manage water resources that cross state or national boundaries, demonstrating that the fundamental logistical and political problems of hydraulic management haven't changed as much as we might assume. Even the darker aspects of hydraulic governance persist in modern forms. The ancient use of water distribution to reward loyalty and punish dissent finds its contemporary equivalent in how modern governments sometimes allocate infrastructure projects or disaster relief based on political considerations rather than pure need. The monopoly on technical knowledge that ancient priests maintained has its parallel in how modern governments sometimes control or limit access to environmental data that could challenge official policies. And the way ancient rulers used massive construction projects to demonstrate their power and generate employment continues today in what political scientists sometimes call pork barrel spending, where politicians fund visible infrastructure projects to gain popular support and stimulate local economies. These continuities remind us that technological advancement doesn't necessarily change the fundamental political dynamics that emerge when humans try to manage essential resources. What's particularly fascinating is how these ancient hydraulic governance models have proven adaptable to dramatically different political philosophies over time. The same basic administrative structures that served absolute monarchs in ancient Egypt were adapted to serve colonial powers building irrigation systems in their overseas territories, then were further adapted by post-colonial states and modern democracies. The technical bureaucracy that managed water for pharaohs proved remarkably compatible with communism, capitalism, and every other economic system because the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to coordinate human activity around unpredictable natural resources that everyone needs but nobody can control individually. This suggests that there's something about water management specifically that tends to produce certain kinds of administrative structures, regardless of the political ideology they're supposed to serve. The enduring power of this hydraulic legacy becomes especially apparent during environmental crises, when governments naturally fall back on ancient patterns of response. When floods threaten major population centers or droughts create water shortages, modern states typically respond with centralized emergency measures, commandeering resources, and imposing rationing systems that would look familiar to an ancient Egyptian official facing a low Nile year. The psychological expectation that the government should predict, prevent, and respond to hydrological disasters dates back to those earliest civilizations where royal legitimacy literally depended on flood management. This creates tremendous pressure on modern governments to demonstrate competence during water crises, precisely because for thousands of years, effective water management has been the ultimate test of political authority. This drive to control water for political power, perfected over millennia, forces us to confront a profound and persistent ethical question that resonates just as strongly today as it did in the time of the pharaohs. Where should humanity draw the line between managing nature for our benefit and dominating it for our ambition? The ancient rulers who first harnessed the floods operated with a worldview that saw the natural environment as something to be subdued and commanded, a resource to be leveraged for state building and social control. Their monumental achievements in irrigation and flood management came with hidden costs that they either could not see or chose to ignore. In Mesopotamia, for instance, the very irrigation networks that made the desert bloom eventually led to widespread soil salinity, as rising water tables brought salt to the surface, slowly poisoning the land and reducing crop yields over generations. This is one of history's earliest and clearest examples of how short-term political gains from environmental manipulation can create long-term ecological crises that ultimately undermine the society they were meant to sustain. This pattern of unintended consequences didn't end with the ancient world. It simply scaled up with our technology. Today's massive dam projects, often justified with the same language of progress and development that ancient rulers might have used, continue this tradition of large-scale environmental intervention with complex ethical implications. Consider the Three Gorges Dam in China, an engineering marvel that provides clean energy and flood control but also displaced over 1 million people and irrevocably altered one of the world's great river ecosystems. Or the numerous dams along the Mekong River that generate electricity for growing economies but threaten the food security of downstream communities who depend on the river's natural sediment flow and fish migrations. These modern projects force us to ask the same fundamental question that the ancient experiences raise: who benefits from this control and who bears the cost? The historical record suggests that centralized water management, whether in ancient Egypt or the modern American West, tends to disproportionately benefit political and economic elites while displacing indigenous communities, small farmers, and ecosystems that have less political power. This brings us to the core ethical dilemma that connects the ancient nilometers to modern water policy boards. Who has the right to decide how a river should be managed? In ancient times, this authority was claimed by rulers who presented themselves as divinely appointed intermediaries. Today, the decision-making process is theoretically more democratic, but it often remains dominated by technical experts, government agencies, and corporate interests far removed from the communities most affected by hydrological changes. The voices of those who have lived in sustainable relationship with rivers for generations, indigenous communities, traditional farmers, local fishers, are frequently marginalized in favor of large-scale development projects that promise broad economic benefits but deliver concentrated costs to vulnerable populations. This represents a continuation of the ancient pattern where the knowledge and needs of ordinary people were secondary to the political and economic objectives of the powerful. Perhaps the most valuable ethical lesson from these ancient hydraulic societies is the danger of creating systems that are too rigid, too optimized for a specific set of environmental conditions. The Akkadian Empire and Old Kingdom Egypt collapsed in part because they had built entire civilizations around hydrological patterns that eventually changed beyond their capacity to adapt. Their sophisticated water management systems, perfectly tuned to the climate of their era, became vulnerabilities when that climate shifted. This historical warning is urgently relevant today as we face our own period of rapid climate change. Our massive dam systems, irrigation networks, and flood control infrastructure are designed based on historical hydrological data that may no longer be reliable guides to the future. The ethical imperative now is to build water management systems that are not just efficient but resilient systems that can adapt to changing conditions without catastrophic failure, and that distribute both the benefits of control and the risks of uncertainty more fairly across society. These ancient experiences ultimately challenge us to develop a new ethical framework for our relationship with water, one that learns from both the successes and failures of our hydraulic ancestors. It suggests that sustainable water management must balance technical control with ecological humility, recognizing that rivers are not just resources to be exploited but complex living systems that we are part of, not apart from. It argues for decision-making processes that are truly inclusive, that listen to traditional knowledge alongside engineering expertise, and that consider the long-term health of the entire watershed rather than just short-term political or economic gains. The rivers that once served as time machines for ancient rulers now measure something even more important: our growing ethical understanding of how to live within nature's limits while ensuring justice for all who depend on the waters that give life. From the Nile's predictable rhythms to the Tigris-Euphrates' volatile surges, rivers truly served as nature's time machines that ancient rulers masterfully harnessed to control politics, economies, and societies. These powerful hydrological systems became far more than sources of water. They transformed into sophisticated instruments of political power that shaped civilizations for millennia, creating governance models whose echoes we still recognize in our world today. The intricate dance between seasonal floods and political authority reveals one of humanity's most enduring stories: our constant attempt to master natural forces for social organization and control. As we now face unprecedented water challenges intensified by climate change, these historical lessons about flood-based power remain not just interesting archaeological footnotes but profoundly relevant guides for understanding our relationship with the planet's most vital resource. The remarkable ingenuity of these ancient systems lies in how they turned something as natural as a river's flow into a mechanism for measuring time itself. By observing and recording flood patterns with astonishing precision, early civilizations developed calendars that synchronized human activity with nature's rhythms. This ability to predict the future, to know when the waters would rise and fall, granted rulers unprecedented control over their populations. Farmers who depended on this knowledge for their survival naturally looked to these authorities as essential intermediaries between themselves and the unpredictable forces of nature. This dependency created stable but authoritarian systems where water management became synonymous with political control, establishing patterns of governance that would persist for thousands of years. What makes these ancient strategies so fascinating is their sophisticated blend of science and spirituality. Priesthoods developed genuine hydrological expertise through careful observation of celestial movements and river behaviors, then presented this knowledge as divine revelation rather than empirical science. This clever fusion created self-reinforcing systems where accurate predictions enhanced political legitimacy, while failed forecasts could be explained as resulting from insufficient piety, thus demanding greater devotion to the established order. The psychological impact on ordinary people cannot be overstated. Living with the constant anxiety of potential flood or drought made populations willing to accept centralized authority in exchange for the security of prediction and protection. This deep environmental psychology became the invisible architecture of power, more effective than any army or palace wall in maintaining social order across generations. The legacy of these hydraulic empires surrounds us in ways we might not immediately recognize. Modern nations still engage in water politics that would feel familiar to an Egyptian pharaoh or Mesopotamian king, though now with satellites and computer models instead of nilometers and star charts. The massive dam projects that reshape entire regions, the international disputes over river rights, the strategic use of water access in diplomacy, all these contemporary issues represent the latest chapter in humanity's long story of using water as an instrument of power. Even our expectations that governments should manage water resources and provide disaster relief during droughts or floods descend directly from these ancient systems where royal legitimacy depended on effective hydrological management. As climate change disrupts the predictable patterns that these ancient civilizations took for granted, we find ourselves facing questions similar to those that confronted the rulers of the past, but on a global scale. How do we manage shared water resources when traditional patterns become unreliable? What ethical responsibilities do upstream nations have toward those downstream? How can we balance the need for development with the necessity of environmental sustainability? The experiences of hydraulic empires offer valuable cautionary tales about the dangers of building societies too rigidly around specific environmental assumptions. The same patterns that brought them success eventually made them vulnerable to change. Their collapses remind us that even the most brilliantly engineered systems can fail when climate shifts beyond their capacity to adapt. This journey through hydraulic history reveals something fundamental about the human relationship with nature. Our attempts to control water have always been about more than mere survival. They represent our deepest aspirations to shape our destiny, to impose order on chaos, and to create lasting civilizations. The rivers that once served as time machines for ancient rulers now measure something even more important: our growing understanding that true power lies not in dominating nature but in learning to live in balance with it. The challenges we face today require us to draw on both the technical ingenuity of our ancestors and the wisdom to recognize that water, in the end, remains a force that connects us all across time, across cultures, and across the artificial boundaries we've created. If you found this exploration of how rivers shaped human destiny compelling, we'd love to continue this conversation with you. Subscribe for more journeys into the fascinating ways nature has influenced history, and share your perspectives on contemporary water politics in the comments below. What parallels do you see between ancient hydraulic empires and modern water management challenges?